They say time gets easier, and sometimes it doesn't. Even to this day, 24 years later, it still seems like it was yesterday.
There's no way to describe the pain that a mother can feel. There's just no way.
The victim's neck was sliced almost to the point of being decapitated.
We learned that the night that she disappeared, there was a big fight.
Witnesses told us they could hear banging around in the apartment upstairs.
They just kept making me repeat my story. And they were like, so you're angry? They're like, you have a bad temper? And I'm like, yes, yes. And I'm like, but I did not kill her.
It was a very volatile situation.
There was information that was developed that then led us more to look at this married couple.
There always seemed to be an argument about this one person.
It was ruining his marriage, his life.
And the question was, well, was she just a witness or did she help? He made allegations that she offered him money and sex to kill him. This was a love triangle with a fatal ending.
In the early afternoon of June 15, 2000, a 911 call comes in from the National Canal Museum in Easton, Pennsylvania.
We have a canal in Easton, and there is a museum there on the property, but it also has a parking area. People can go down there. It's a recreational site. It's frequented by citizens in the Easton area. There were Canal Museum employees, security-type folks for the area, that saw these girls in the parking lot who were hysterical and were screaming. There was a suspected death, so law enforcement was contacted.
I was working the day shift with another detective, and we got called to the scene. My lieutenant, police, Lieutenant Parkansky, also responded.
Upon arriving at the scene, detectives learn Michelle Hetzel and Carrie Renner found the victim, who they identify as 19-year-old Devin Guzman.
We arrived there, Michelle and Carrie are there, crying. They're sitting on a stone wall, pointing to Devin's car. It was a silver Pontiac.
When we looked in the car, we saw a young female with a jacket covered over her.
Devin Guzman was sort of in a fetal-type position, curled up on the seat. She had a syringe on her nearby.
The syringe was tucked in her waistband.
They determined that Devin Guzman is deceased because the syringe was there. There was a thought that she may have committed suicide or there was some kind of drug overdose.
Detectives learn Carrie Renner is Devin's roommate and girlfriend. She and Michelle had reported Devin missing earlier that morning.
Carrie goes on to tell us exactly, what happened.
The night before, Devin and I were fighting. We were throwing things around the apartment. It was just getting heated. So Devin left to go down to Michelle's house.
According to Carrie, Devin was going to Michelle Hetzel's residence. They were friends, but then Hetzel contacts Carrie Renner and says, Devin didn't show up, where is she?
So there was an alert put out to our police department and the other police departments.
Michelle and Carrie. They also called the 911 center several times to follow up. They were very concerned about her. They started driving around looking for her. Eventually, they go to the Canal Museum. Apparently, that's a place that was important to Devin, so they decided that, maybe she went there to go for a walk.
So we pulled in. Devin's car was there. I walked up to the car, and I looked in, and I didn't see her. So I'm like, Michelle, she's not here. And, Michelle kind of gasped, put her hand over her mouth, and she's like, what do you mean she's not there? Which prompted me to look again. And I'm like, oh, she's sleeping in the back seat. So for some reason, I had Devin's keys. Devin had mine. I unlocked the door. I noticed that her lips and her eyebrows were purple. So I reached and I grabbed onto her jacket and I shook her and I said, "Baby, are you okay?" She didn't respond. So I yelled for Michelle to come so we could take her to the hospital. At that time, there was a city worker nearby and he heard what was going on and he suggested to have the police come. So the police show up, the ambulance is there. Finally, one of the medics just looks over and shouts that she's dead.
I had known Devin's father from high school. To tell her parents and her family, it was heartbreaking.
Around 1 in the afternoon, I got a phone call saying that they found her in the back of her car and she wasn't with us anymore. There's no way to describe the pain that a mother can feel. There's just no way.
Born in 1981, Devin Guzman grew up in a tight-knit family in Easton, Pennsylvania.
Devin, growing up, she was a tomboy. Devin always was a lot of fun. The life of the party, you know.
Devin's personality was very bubbly, always happy. She was always very lively and on the go.
As a teenager, Devin became fast friends with Carrie Renner and Michelle Hetzel.
When I first came to Easton in 91, I met Michelle at the bus stop and we instantly became friends. Then I first met Devin through Michelle. I was a year older than them, so I was the only one that was driving at the time. Devin was carefree. You know, she had a big heart. She had a wild imagination. Everybody that she came in contact with loved her.
She was just a normal high school girl. Went to school, again, still liked the roller skating. Hanging with her cousins, going to the football games.
We just continued to hang out until our friendship, evolved into a relationship for the both of us. Well, coming public, it was 1996, and it was not acceptable. We were often judged, where we went. Devin's mom always accepted us.
But it didn't matter to me. I mean, if that's who she was and that's what she wanted out of her life, then I loved her anyway. It didn't matter. And she knew that.
Devin and Carrie seemed happy. They never stayed home. They were always out. Go to the park, go for hikes, take drives, whatever they wanted to do.
After high school, Carrie asked Devin to move in with her.
She just wanted to settle down, and she was excited when she finally did get her own place with Carrie. Devin and Carrie also briefly talked a little bit about moving to Arizona.
She has family there. But, we were young, so we didn't have money. So she had applied for a Sunoco gas card. And so we were waiting for that to come in the mail.
Wherever life was going to take her, she was going. That was Devin.
Now, at only 19 years old, Devin Guzman's body has been found in the backseat of her own car by her girlfriend.
So first we photographed the scene to make sure we have an accurate representation of what we see when we arrived. And then once we started to move her, we observed a large laceration on her throat.
The victim's neck was sliced almost to the point of being decapitated,
which then immediately suggested that this was a homicide.
There was a small knife that was in her hand.
But that knife was too small to commit those injuries. And it was obviously not possible. She slit her throat herself. Due to the severity of the laceration, you would have expected to see a tremendous amount of blood in the car, and there was very minimal amount of blood in the vehicle.
That car would have been covered with blood, but there was very little blood under her.
So we know immediately that she was killed somewhere else and then brought to the Canal Museum. Someone tried to stage the body to make it look like a suicide.
Someone was trying to lead law enforcement or investigators to believe that this was a self-inflicted wound, but it was amateurish. It appears that the people that were staging this didn't really know what they were doing.
Well, we're kind of looking at Michelle and Carrie because they report her missing. They find her. Carrie's the last one to see her. We know that with them finding her and it being staged, that there's a possibility that one or both of them are involved in the murder of Devin.
Coming up, detectives uncover complex dynamics in Devin's love life.
They are still actively involved in some kind of a sexual relationship. She starts to point out instances where she would get very, very jealous and very upset.
She would always cause a ruckus and chaos.
She had had a fight, a pretty violent fight with Devin that night before she went missing.
Hours after 19-year-old Devin Guzman was found murdered in the back of her car, detectives asked Devin's girlfriend, Carrie Renner, and close friend, Michelle Hetzel, to make a formal statement.
We were very aware early in this investigation that this was a stage scene. Someone wanted to make it look like a suicide.
So the girls are at the scene. They're the ones that have found Devin. So it's imperative that we get a statement from them.
Carrie and Michelle went back to the police station. They were interviewed.
Detectives begin their line of questioning with Devin's friend, Michelle.
We start to ask her about the relationship that she has with Devin. We find out Michelle and Devin knew each other from school.
Michelle presented herself as sort of a meek and mild young girl, and her statement to the police is that, Devin, they're friends, they'd had a relationship.
She said, and then at one point, they were lovers in high school.
What we learned was that Devin had a sexual relationship with Carrie, and Devin also had a sexual relationship with Michelle. Michelle acknowledged that the sexual relationship was over, that she's with her husband now, she's happy with her husband.
After high school, at some point, Michelle met Brandon Bloss, and then they got married.
Michelle was 18 when they got married, and Brandon was 5 or 6 years older than Michelle.
After learning she and Devin were once lovers, detectives asked Michelle if that caused any known issues in Carrie and Devin's relationship.
Michelle said Carrie would get very, very jealous and very upset. And she starts to point out instances where Carrie and Devin had domestic arguments.
She said Carrie was jealous very much of Devin's and Michelle's relationship because they were still friends.
Down the hall, detectives confront Carrie about her relationship with Devin.
We learned that the night that she disappeared, there was a big fight between Carrie and Devin.
Devin came home from her father's house and she was wasted. She lied about Michelle being there at her dad's house. And I was really angry. She was really trying to calm me down. But then Michelle started paging her. She wanted to hang out. So Michelle was persistent, and she kept paging her and kept paging her. Devin and I kept fighting. Devin was pretty irate at this time. Devin wanted to drive down to Michelle's house. I told her that this makes zero sense. You're drunk, you're gonna kill yourself. If you're going to Michelle's, then I'll drive. It was pretty silent on the ride to Michelle's house because I was beyond being mad and disappointed and angry at Devin. So we get to Michelle's house and I wait in the car and Devin goes over and knocks on the door, and it took Brandon maybe a minute or so to answer the door. He saw me in the car and he said that Michelle doesn't want me around, take me home, that she didn't want me there. So Devin was pretty mad. She came back to the car. She punched the hood of the roof while she walked by, and she got in the car. The ride home, we had started talking, and she did say that she was going to go back, and I still was not happy about that. We get back to the apartment. She wanted to walk me up the stairs. She went to give me a kiss, so I turned my head because I was mad, and so she kissed my cheek, and I said, she told me she loved me, and I was like, whatever. And then I walked up the stairs. So Devin left to go down to Michelle's house, and I went inside and I went to sleep. I woke up to Michelle paging me. It was probably about like midnight now, 12:30. And she kept paging me and paging me and paging me and calling. So I finally answer the phone, and she accuses me of keeping Devin against her will. She's saying that Devin never showed up. I'm like, Devin's not here. And so she shows up. She shows up probably around like 2 o'clock or something like that. Michelle sees that Devin's not there, and like she's paranoid and she's worried, and she wants me to report her missing.
Carrie did not initially want to call the 911 center. She tells us that Michelle's the one that's insistent about calling and reporting the missing person.
So finally, around, I don't know, maybe 3 in the morning, I gave in and I called the police.
Michelle Hetzel says maybe we ought to call the police and report her a missing person. And I think Carrie's reluctant to do that. So that was suspicious. And that's why Carrie was a focus of the investigation.
But Carrie claimed she had nothing to do with it.
Detectives circled back to Michelle Hetzel, who reiterates her concerns about the last time she saw Devin and Carrie.
Michelle Hetzel is trying to imply in her statement that, there was a fight between Devin and Carrie and maybe she got hurt there. But she maintains that she never showed back up at her home again.
I didn't know at that time, but Michelle was basically pinning it on me.
Detectives in Easton, Pennsylvania are beginning to suspect that Devin Guzman's volatile relationship with Carrie Renner may have been the catalyst for Devin's murder.
Carrie acknowledged that she had had a fight, a pretty violent fight with Devin that night before she went missing. And so because of that, we look at her as a potential suspect.
But as her interview with police continues, Carrie shares a detail about the fight that Michelle Hetzel failed to mention.
Carrie does tell us that Michelle and Devin are still actively involved in some kind of a sexual relationship, which contradicts what Michelle told us.
Devin and I were together and we were doing great. And Michelle would just always try to interfere.
Devin was living with Carrie, but then would go meet Michelle, and that would obviously start an argument.
Devin would be sorry, and she would come home, and then, eventually things would be fine with us.
Carrie tells us that Michelle is a very jealous person regarding Devin, that even though she's married to Brandon, that, she's fiercely protective of Devin and believes that those two are going to be together forever.
Carrie tells detectives that Devin and Michelle had recently taken a romantic vacation together.
We find out that Devin and Michelle had gone to the Virgin Islands. The trip to the Virgin Islands occurred shortly before the murder.
I do remember Devin calling me once from the islands, and I was not pleased. I was irate. I was told that they exchanged rings. I think it was kind of just, teenagers saying, I vow to, be with you kind of thing.
Carrie was very upset about that. She thought that Devin was going to be exclusive with her, so she was very upset about that this relationship was occurring.
She came home. I'm not sure how things got back to good, but I just saw a change in Devin, that she was ready to stop this teenage drama of a relationship. So she felt the only way to do that was for us to get out of Easton. So we were going to head to Mesa, Arizona. And I believe that Devin was just doing the right thing. You know, like she really wanted to grow.
Following their interviews, detectives released both Michelle and Carrie.
There was no arrest. They came in voluntarily. They're free to go.
They both denied being involved in the murder.
I mean, law enforcement, this is not unusual. We start hearing different stories, and we have to start to compare notes and find out who's telling the truth.
After the interviews, we're kind of looking at Carrie. She's still a suspect at that point. Carrie's the last one to see her. Carrie is there when we find her. They had a fight just before Devin left, so we applied for a search warrant.
Within hours, detectives conduct the search of Devin and Carrie's apartment.
Inside, it looked like there were obvious signs of some kind of confrontation or disturbance. Furniture that had been tossed. It just looked like there was some kind of fight there. During the execution of that search warrant, we locate a car mat in the shower, which would probably indicate that somebody was trying to wash something off that.
That's when it gets into the use of luminol. Luminol is a chemical that reacts to any type of blood.
And we found some blood residue on that car mat.
Well, at that time we're thinking Carrie must have dropped some blood on the car mat while she was staging her body in the back of her car.
This might be evidence that Devin Guzman was murdered here. The blood goes to the lab, and we have to wait till we get the result to find out what's going on. But that was one of the reasons why we were looking at Carrie early on.
With physical evidence secured, detectives begin canvassing the neighborhood.
She and Devin lived over top of a bar, and we ended up talking to the bartender and some other patrons who told us that the night of the murder, and they could hear banging around in the apartment upstairs where Devin and Carrie lived.
So because of that, we look at her as maybe she did harm later to Devin.
When detectives return to the station, they discover prior reports connected to the couple's relationship.
She and Devin lived in Forks Township. There were several police calls to the Forks Township Police Department where they would have sometimes violent, physical domestics. Their relationship was very volatile.
We're not solely focused on Carrie, but Carrie is, in my opinion, she was the primary suspect at that time.
Authorities in eastern Pennsylvania have zeroed in on Carrie Renner as the primary suspect in her girlfriend Devin Guzman's murder. On June 17, 2000, detectives bring Carrie back to the station to confront her with the evidence.
It was 2 days after she died, and it just went on and on for what seemed like the entire day. They just kept making me repeat my story. And I kept saying it. I kept saying the same thing. And they're like, so you're angry. They're like, you have a bad temper. And I'm like, yes. And I'm like, but I did not kill her. So it's quite terrifying. Finally, I stand up and I'm like, are you going to arrest me or can I leave? And so they say, well, you could have left hours ago. So I left.
Even though we didn't find anything conclusive, we requested that Carrie take a polygraph exam, and she did several days later.
She passed, and focus then went away from her pretty much.
The night before we buried him, my son Derek and I, when we spoke to Carrie, and at one point he just kind of looked her in the eye and said, you see these eyes? These are my sister's eyes, too. You look at me and tell me you didn't kill her. And Carrie said, I swear to God I didn't hurt her. I didn't kill her. My gut feeling was telling me that she didn't do it.
Later that day, detectives receive an unexpected call that puts Devin's alleged lover, Michelle Hetzel, back in the spotlight.
We get some information by an individual by the name of George Vine, who goes on to tell us that he knows Michelle and Devin.
He was a friend of theirs, and they took an affinity to going over to his place and hanging out. I think that they would have alcohol there.
According to George, Michelle had recently made an alarming proposition.
He made allegations that Michelle offered him money and sex to kill Devin.
We asked George why he didn't, talk to us sooner about this, and he tells us that, he didn't really believe that she was sincere, that he thought she was just drunk and just talking, until Devin's found at the Canal Museum.
On June 21st, 6 days after Devin was found murdered, detectives set up surveillance outside Michelle Hetzel's home, where she lives with her husband, Brandon Bloss.
We wanted physical evidence, and so we're watching these people now, and watching them take the trash out one day.
Once somebody's garbage can is put out where it's available to the public, we can seize that trash without a search warrant.
Well, this detective did. He did what was known as a garbage pull. What he found in the garbage was gauze pads that had been used over a wound. And even to the normal person looking at it, it looked like a bite mark.
So we apply for a search warrant to search Brandon and Michelle's house. The search warrant's granted. We execute the search warrant.
Inside the house, there was a washer, that there was some clothes and that were still wet.
We find a pair of jeans inside the washing machine. I believe had some blood. During the examination of the jeans that was seized from Michelle and Brandon's house, we found a needle cap inside the one pants pocket.
There was a needle cap that was consistent with the syringe that was found on the body of the victim.
So now we're starting to doubt not only some of the things that Michelle's told us, almost everything that Michelle told us.
Coming up, as the investigation shifts, forensic evidence solidifies the case against a surprising suspect.
He told us that it was a human bite mark. We exhumed her body and did a casting of her teeth.
And authorities pinpoint the motive.
They both cooperated and conspired together to kill this poor young girl.
I guess love does crazy things to you.
Just days after Devin Guzman was found brutally murdered, detectives have discovered possible evidence connecting her close friend and alleged married lover, Michelle Hetzel, to Devin's murder.
In the house, I didn't recover those jeans, and that's when the cap to the syringe was found. That was only a small piece, but it helped put the whole puzzle together.
We also found some blood residue in the backyard.
There was blood on a hose, which suggests that maybe blood is being washed away, as a result of a crime. So this is all circumstantial evidence that a crime may have been committed at this location.
As a forensic team continues their work, detectives speak with neighbors of Michelle Hetzel and Brandon Bloss.
And that's when we came up with a witness, Joe Welsh, who lived across the street.
They seemed like a nice young couple. Michelle was fairly outgoing and would wave to our two little sons at the time. Brandon seemed more reserved, just typical neighbors across the street. As we got later into the spring and into the summer, there seemed to be much more tension between Brandon and Michelle. There were several particularly explosive incidents getting into the early June timeframe. There always seemed to be an argument about this one person who I now know was Devin Guzman.
And he explains to us that he hears a pretty graphic and heated argument at Brandon and Michelle's house the night that Devin went missing.
Michelle came home, and Brandon was shouting from inside the house, just berating her. And Michelle got down on the sidewalk in almost a prayer stance and started shouting, "What the F do you want from me? What the F do you want from me?"
Joe tells detectives that the couple eventually returned inside.
12:35 that morning, I was awoken by a disturbance, shouting. And I looked out, and it was one woman with her back to me, and then two people inside the house, basically telling her that she couldn't be in the house. And I then saw the woman that I now know to be Devin slam her fist on the hood of the car, and she got in her car and she left.
Joe Welsh tells us at some point a little later that he sees Devin's car come back.
Joe Welsh was an important witness because he was able to verify that Devin had been there and left and then came back again, which was consistent with Carrie Renner's story. And according to Hetzel, that never occurred.
So we knew right away. Michelle lied through her teeth about that.
With the couple's home being the possible crime scene, detectives focus on Brandon to find out what he knows.
So we're aware that Brandon is involved in this argument with Michelle, with Devin. So we asked Brandon to come in for an interview. Brandon was a very quiet individual. He appeared very intelligent, no criminal history.
He was a college-educated person. He had a degree in chemistry, so he was a very bright guy. He met Michelle when they were very young, fell in love with Michelle, and ends up marrying Michelle.
Detectives confront Brandon about his wife's on-again, off-again affair with Devin, and he admits that it had made him uncomfortable.
Michelle took Devin to the Virgin Islands and used Brandon's credit card. So, Brandon's very, very upset and very angry about this.
But he said that he had faith that Michelle was going to change and be a real wife to him.
Brandon maintains that neither he nor Michelle had anything to do with Devin's murder.
Eventually, then, we get search warrants to get DNA and photograph Brandon.
He's forced to show us his arms, and when he does, very visible bite marks on his arm. He said that there was some kind of fight going on between Michelle and Devin, and he tried to break it up and got bit.
We didn't really believe Brandon. At the time of Brandon's interview, we did not have enough to charge anyone, so he was allowed to leave.
So Brandon and Michelle's car is impounded. It's made part of the crime scene. It's photographed, and ultimately a search warrant is issued in order to find out if there's any evidence that might be helpful in the case.
Inside the trunk, we find a bloody sweatshirt. That's an ichelle. We find men's sneakers that have blood on them.
They were sent away to the State Police Crime Lab.
At this point, the evidence is really piling up, so we are fairly sure that Brandon now is involved in this. We asked an odontologist to look at the injury to Brandon's arm, and he told us that he believed that it was a human bite mark. We believed that it was Devin that bit him.
But we had to take a bite mark impression from Devin's teeth to be 100% sure.
Unfortunately, she had been buried by that time. We applied for a court order to exhume her body.
I believe the family, was very upset about it, but they understood the need for it.
We exhumed her body and did a casting of her teeth. The casting of her teeth, along with the detailed photographs that were taken from Brandon's arm, were sent to a forensic odontologist.
It was nearly a perfect match.
Brandon is right-handed. If he came up from behind her and put her in like a chokehold position, it would have been in the spot where she would have bit him. The bite mark to Brandon's arm would suggest that Devin put up a fight.
Then the question was, well, was Michelle just a witness to Brandon killing her, or did she help?
Authorities have discovered evidence that connects 25-year-old Brandon Bloss to the murder of Devin Guzman. Detectives suspect that Brandon's wife, Michelle Hetzel, also played a role.
So we believe that Michelle's involved because somebody had to drive Devin's car to the Canal Museum and then pick somebody up. So it would suggest that two people were involved.
And Michelle lied about lots of things in terms of this whole case. Plus, the fact that she tried to hire a hitman just a short time prior to that showed a motive to want to kill Devin.
In August of 2000, nearly 2 months after the murder, authorities received promising results from the crime lab.
We eventually received the report on the DNA from the blood on the clothing that we found in their car, and it was confirmed that it was Devin's blood. During the examination of the jeans that was seized from Michelle and Brandon's washing machine, the blood was diluted to the point where they could not do any more processing with that.
The forensic report officially clears Devin's girlfriend, Carrie Renner, as a suspect.
The blood that was found in Carrie and Devin's shower, it turned out that it was not Devin's.
It was determined not to be relevant. We now have a puzzle that is being put together by circumstantial evidence. The victims bit this man. We have statements, by George Vine that Michelle was trying to do harm to the victim. And we have motive that Brandon Bloss wasn't happy what was going on with Devin and his wife.
Michelle was definitely obsessed with Devin. She would get very upset and angry when Devin would bounce back and forth between her and Carrie. We believe that Devin probably told her that, look, we're done. I'm going to go with Carrie. And Michelle being angry, saying, if I can't have her, no one's going to have her. And probably went to Brandon and said, look, if you help me do this, this will save our marriage. So that's what we think the motive was. My theory is that they lured Devin over there with the intent to kill her. That Brandon probably came up behind her, put his arm around her neck, start to choke her out, slit her throat. Then they both carried her out back, put her in a car, drove down to the Canal Museum, which was a short distance away from their house, set up the crime scene, and then come back and make up this story as they didn't see her, and then go from there. We never found the murder weapon.
The murder weapon, the knife, could have been dumped in the water. The current can be pretty strong in the waters in that location.
Nearly 1 month after Devin Guzman was murdered, authorities issue arrest warrants for Michelle Hetzel and Brandon Bloss.
They were charged with criminal homicide and criminal conspiracy to commit homicide, and we took them into custody.
When I found out that they were arrested, I'm not really sure how I felt. I didn't feel relieved. I didn't feel content.
She didn't like Carrie and Devin being happy, so she would always cause a ruckus and chaos. But I never thought she'd go that far, of course. No one ever thought she'd go that far, as to, kill my daughter.
Michelle and Brandon refused to talk, so we could not interview them.
Prosecutors decide to try the couple together. Opening arguments get underway on September 25th, 2001.
We felt we had a strong case, but it wasn't a slam dunk. We had no confessions. It was not going to be easy. And we argued to the jury that both cooperated and conspired together to kill this poor young girl and then plant her body down at the Canal Museum.
Prosecutors argue Michelle's jealousy, combined with Brandon's fear of losing his wife, culminated in murder.
I think that Brandon just had enough of Devin Guzman's involvement with Michelle. I think that he was tired of her. I think that, he was ruining his marriage, his life.
Brandon was just madly in love with her, and he was tired of her always leaving to go to Devin. Michelle was always manipulative. She convinced him, if you just get rid of Devin, she's the issue, then we can be happy. And I guess love does crazy things to you.
This was a love triangle with a fatal ending.
There's no question that Michelle Hetzel manipulates people. She's a pathological liar.
Michelle and Brandon at the trial, they just sat there. They had no emotion. And they were pointing the finger at each other. So they blamed each other for it.
On October 4th, 2001, the jury deliberates the couple's fate. Just after midnight, they reach a verdict.
The verdict was guilty of homicide, first-degree murder.
My whole family was grateful that they convicted both of them, and it was a feeling of relief.
This crime was a tragedy for the community. Devin was well-loved by a lot of people.
They say time gets easier, and sometimes it doesn't. Even to this day, 24 years later, it still seems like it was yesterday.
This whole thing ruined many, many lives. It changed my life. I have amazing kids, an amazing career in the Army, and some days it's hard to be happy. And I believe that's because, I've only ever really loved Devin. And I still keep her presence strong in my everyday life.
On an ordinary October afternoon in a quiet Canadian town, a 9-year-old girl disappeared in broad daylight, and for the next 35 years, every answer uncovered by investigators seemed to create an even darker question. The streets were calm. The trees had begun surrendering their leaves to the cold wind. Parents believed they knew every neighbor by name. Children still walked home alone after school because this was the kind of place where danger belonged to television broadcasts, not to real life. Yet somewhere between a short walk and the front door she never reached, that comforting illusion shattered forever. Before the sun had set, an entire community found itself staring into a nightmare that would haunt generations, expose catastrophic failures in one of Canada's most notorious criminal investigations, destroy an innocent man's life, and ultimately reveal that the real killer had remained hidden in plain sight until science accomplished what decades of traditional detective work could not. October 3rd, Sill 1984, began like countless autumn days in the small community of Queensville, Ontario. Christine Jessup was energetic, cheerful, and known for her bright smile. Friends remembered a girl who loved ordinary childhood adventures, someone whose biggest concerns should have been homework, games, and family. Nothing about that Wednesday suggested it would become one of the darkest dates in Canadian criminal history. As afternoon arrived, Christine left for a short errand. The distance was familiar. The route was simple. It was a journey she had every reason to believe was completely safe. But somewhere along that familiar stretch of road, someone was watching. Someone seized an opportunity that lasted only moments yet changed countless lives forever. When Christine failed to return home, concern quickly replaced routine. At first, relatives hoped for an innocent explanation. Perhaps she had stopped to visit a friend. Maybe she had become distracted while playing. Those possibilities began disappearing with every passing minute. Phone calls produced no answers. Neighbors checked their yards. Friends were questioned. Parents drove familiar roads searching desperately for any sign of the little girl. As daylight faded into darkness, fear settled over Queensville with crushing weight. The realization spread rapidly that this was no ordinary missing child report. Something had gone terribly wrong. Police mobilized almost immediately. Officers searched roadsides, wooded areas, fields, and drainage ditches. Volunteers poured into the search effort. Farmers interrupted their work. Families left dinner tables untouched. Flashlights illuminated forests long after sunset. Search teams called Christine's name repeatedly into the cold night air, hoping for even the faintest response. Every abandoned building became a potential hiding place. Every pond became a terrifying possibility. Helicopters joined the operation. Tracking dogs searched desperately for a scent that might point investigators in the right direction. Hope remained alive during those first critical hours because every missing child case carries the belief that the next search team might be the one to bring someone home alive. Instead, the days passed without answers. Media coverage intensified. Newspapers printed Christine's photograph across their front pages. Television stations interrupted regular programming with updates. Radio broadcasts urged anyone who had seen the young girl to contact authorities immediately. The story spread far beyond Queensville. Across Ontario, parents looked at their own children differently. Walks to school suddenly seemed dangerous. Quiet suburban roads no longer felt completely secure. A single disappearance had transformed the emotional landscape of an entire province. Investigators worked around the clock. They reconstructed Christine's final known movements minute by minute. Every reported sighting was examined. Every vehicle noticed in the area became significant. Detectives interviewed relatives, neighbors, delivery drivers, construction workers, and strangers passing through town. Hundreds of tips flooded police lines. Most proved useless. Some contradicted each other. Others consumed valuable investigative time before ending in disappointment. Yet every lead had to be pursued because no one could afford to overlook the one detail that might expose the truth. The uncertainty became unbearable for Christine's family. Each passing day without news created a painful conflict between hope and fear. Hope insisted she might still be alive somewhere, waiting to be rescued. Fear whispered a far darker possibility that no parent ever wants to imagine. Every ringing telephone became emotionally exhausting. Every unexpected knock at the door forced family members to brace themselves for news capable of changing their lives forever. Then on October 31st, nearly 4 weeks after Christine disappeared, searchers made a devastating discovery. Her body was found in a wooded area approximately 50 kilometers from where she had vanished. The discovery ended one nightmare only to begin another. The isolated location immediately suggested deliberate concealment. Whoever committed the crime had transported Christine away from the community where she disappeared, choosing a place where the chances of accidental discovery remained painfully low. Investigators sealed off the area. Forensic specialists documented every detail they could preserve. Photographs recorded the scene from every angle. Evidence technicians searched carefully through leaves, soil, vegetation, and surrounding terrain. Every footprint, every fiber, every microscopic trace held the possibility of identifying the person responsible. The autopsy confirmed what everyone had dreaded. Christine had been murdered. Shock spread across Canada. News reports no longer described a missing child but a homicide investigation involving one of the country's youngest victims. Public grief quickly transformed into outrage. Parents demanded answers. Citizens demanded arrests. Politicians promised resources. Police faced extraordinary pressure to solve the case before fear completely overwhelmed public confidence. The investigation expanded dramatically. Behavioral analysis, witness interviews, forensic examinations, and timeline reconstruction became the foundation of an increasingly complex inquiry. Detectives attempted to identify everyone who had crossed paths with Christine during the final hours before her disappearance. They examined known offenders living nearby. They investigated individuals with histories of violence against children. They pursued reports of suspicious vehicles. Composite sketches were discussed. Potential suspects emerged and disappeared with alarming frequency. Despite the enormous effort, investigators found themselves confronting a brutal reality. There were remarkably few reliable witnesses. No one could confidently describe the abduction, and no one had seen the killer, and no one had reported hearing screams. It was as though the offender had appeared briefly, taken Christine, and vanished without leaving behind a clear trail. That absence of direct evidence forced detectives to rely heavily upon circumstantial information. Every inconsistency mattered. Every rumor required examination. Every anonymous phone call carried potential significance. The enormous volume of information became both a blessing and a curse. Hidden somewhere among thousands of statements might be the truth. Buried equally deep were misunderstandings, false memories, exaggerations, and speculation capable of steering investigators away from the actual offender. The emotional atmosphere surrounding the investigation continued growing heavier. Communities organized vigils. Schools offered counseling. Parents imposed stricter rules on their children. Familiar routines changed almost overnight. Children no longer walked alone. Neighborhood watches appeared. Conversations once centered on ordinary life now revolved around safety, fear, and unanswered questions. Behind closed police doors, detectives experienced growing frustration. Every experienced investigator understands that homicide cases become increasingly difficult as time passes. Physical evidence deteriorates. Witness memories fade. Public attention shifts elsewhere. Opportunities disappear forever. The first days of an investigation often determine its ultimate outcome. Yet despite massive search operations and relentless investigative work, the identity of Christine's killer remained hidden. Still, investigators believed someone knew more than they admitted. Someone had noticed an unfamiliar vehicle. Someone had encountered a suspicious individual. Someone had heard a conversation that seemed meaningless at the time, but suddenly carried enormous importance. Public appeals intensified. Newspapers encouraged citizens to revisit forgotten memories. Police emphasized that even insignificant details might prove crucial. Rewards were discussed. Anonymous tip lines expanded. Detectives hoped guilt, fear, or conscience might eventually persuade someone to come forward. Weeks turned into months. The homicide investigation evolved into one of Canada's most closely watched criminal cases. Pressure mounted relentlessly. Every press conference ended with the same unanswered question: who killed Christine Jessup? Within the investigative team, different theories competed for attention. Some detectives believed the offender was local, familiar with Queensville, and comfortable enough to abduct a child without attracting attention. Others suspected an opportunistic stranger passing through the region. Some focused on individuals connected indirectly to Christine's family. Others believed the killer possessed previous experience committing violent crimes and had deliberately selected a vulnerable victim. None of those theories could be proven. None could be completely eliminated. As forensic scientists continued examining evidence collected from the crime scene and Christine's clothing, investigators relied upon the best technology available in the mid-1980s. But forensic science was still evolving. Techniques that would later revolutionize criminal investigations either did not yet exist or remained in their infancy. Detectives could preserve evidence carefully, but they had no way of knowing that biological traces too small to identify in 1984 would eventually become the silent witness that solved the mystery decades later. That future remained unimaginable. Instead, investigators faced immediate public demands for justice. Television cameras documented grieving family members leaving memorial services. Headlines questioned whether a child killer remained free. Rumors multiplied throughout Ontario. Suspicion settled upon ordinary citizens. Entire lives began changing under the crushing weight of speculation. And somewhere beyond every interview room, every search warrant, every newspaper headline, and every desperate promise that justice would come, the person responsible for Christine Jessup's murder continued living without public identification, carrying a secret that would remain buried for decades while the investigation drifted toward one of the most controversial chapters in Canadian legal history. A chapter that would ultimately reveal not only how difficult it can be to catch a killer, but how dangerously easy it can be to accuse the wrong man. The investigation entered its next phase under an unbearable weight of expectation. More than a month had passed since Christine Jessup disappeared, yet every headline, every television report, and every conversation across Ontario revolved around the same question. Somewhere, a child killer was still free. Detectives knew that every day without an arrest weakened public confidence while strengthening the possibility that crucial evidence would disappear forever. The pressure was no longer simply professional. It became personal. Officers worked exhausting hours, returning home only briefly before another lead demanded attention. Every ringing telephone carried the possibility of a breakthrough. More often, it delivered another rumor, another false sighting, another dead end that consumed valuable time while the real offender remained invisible. Thousands of pages of witness statements began filling investigation files. Detectives reconstructed Christine's final movements repeatedly, hoping fresh eyes might reveal something overlooked. They walked the route she had taken on October 3rd. They measured distances. They estimated timelines. They stopped motorists who regularly traveled the surrounding roads. Delivery schedules were reviewed. Construction crews were interviewed again. Utility workers, postal employees, school staff, local shopkeepers, hunters, farmers, and anyone whose daily routine placed them near Queensville became part of the expanding inquiry. Every ordinary citizen suddenly possessed potential importance. Yet the central mystery refused to move. No witness could identify the person who had taken Christine. No reliable description of a suspect emerged. No vehicle could be connected with certainty to the abduction. The silence surrounding those missing minutes became one of the investigation's greatest obstacles. Police gradually shifted their attention toward individuals who lived close enough to know the area. Experience suggested that many crimes against children were committed not by strangers passing through, but by offenders familiar with local roads, isolated locations, and community routines. Detectives began examining people whose names repeatedly surfaced during interviews. Some had previous criminal histories. Others attracted attention simply because neighbors considered them unusual. Suspicion spread quickly through the small communities surrounding Queensville. Innocent conversations suddenly acquired sinister interpretations. Ordinary behavior became evidence in the eyes of frightened residents. Every unfamiliar face attracted attention. Every rumor gained momentum. The investigation generated an atmosphere where fear and speculation fed each other relentlessly. Police also relied heavily on forensic evidence recovered from the crime scene. Clothing, biological samples, fibers, hairs, and microscopic material were preserved with extraordinary care. Although technology available during the mid-1980s remained limited compared with later decades, investigators understood that physical evidence might ultimately succeed where witness testimony had failed. Laboratories examined countless exhibits using the most advanced scientific methods then available. Results eliminated certain possibilities but failed to identify a clear suspect. As frustration mounted, detectives expanded the investigation beyond York Region. Information was shared with neighboring police services. Similar crimes were reviewed for possible connections. Investigators searched for patterns involving child abductions across Ontario and elsewhere in Canada. Profiles of known violent offenders were compared against the circumstances surrounding Christine's murder. Some names initially appeared promising before collapsing under closer examination. Others generated weeks of investigative effort only to end with confirmed alibis. Meanwhile, Christine's family continued living inside an emotional nightmare from which there was no escape. Birthdays arrived without celebration. Holidays became painful reminders of an empty chair at the family table. Media attention ensured the tragedy never disappeared from public consciousness. Reporters frequently requested interviews. Cameras appeared outside family events. Every anniversary revived the story. Every article reopened wounds that had barely begun to heal. Investigators remained determined to find answers. One increasingly important element of the inquiry involved building a detailed understanding of Christine herself. Detectives examined her personality, friendships, school activities, and daily routines. They wanted to know whether anyone had shown unusual interest in her before the disappearance. Teachers were interviewed. Classmates were questioned with extraordinary sensitivity. Family acquaintances were examined. Police searched for any indication that Christine had been specifically targeted rather than randomly selected. Nothing produced a definitive answer. The absence of an obvious motive complicated the investigation further. There was no ransom demand, no credible threats, no indication that the offender sought publicity. The crime appeared both deliberate and deeply personal, yet investigators could not determine whether the victim had been chosen in advance or encountered by chance. Behavioral specialists attempted to construct a psychological portrait of the unknown killer. They suggested the offender likely possessed enough confidence to approach a child without immediately provoking alarm. The individual may have appeared trustworthy, calm, or familiar enough to lower Christine's natural caution. Transporting the victim to a distant wooded location indicated planning rather than spontaneous violence. The concealment of the body suggested someone attempting to delay discovery and increase the likelihood of escaping detection. These conclusions narrowed possibilities conceptually but not practically. Police still lacked a name. Months continued passing. Behind the scenes, enormous investigative resources remained focused on identifying people whose movements during October 3rd could not be fully explained. Every discrepancy attracted attention. Detectives rechecked employment records, travel schedules, and witness statements repeatedly. Small inconsistencies often became the basis for extensive interviews. Some individuals cooperated willingly. Others grew defensive under repeated questioning. Both reactions generated further suspicion within a community already overwhelmed by fear. The emotional climate became increasingly toxic. Neighbors quietly watched each other. Families whispered private suspicions behind closed doors. Friendships suffered. Trust eroded. In a town once defined by familiarity, uncertainty became the dominant emotion. Investigators also received numerous anonymous tips. Some callers genuinely believed they possessed valuable information. Others appeared motivated by personal grudges. False accusations multiplied. Detectives understood that every allegation required verification because dismissing the wrong tip could allow a murderer to escape justice. Yet following every rumor diverted manpower away from stronger investigative leads. Balancing urgency against caution became an exhausting daily challenge. The enormous case file continued expanding. Maps covered investigation rooms. Photographs lined bulletin boards. Timelines stretched across walls. Colored markers connected locations, witnesses, vehicles, and possible suspects in increasingly complicated patterns. Detectives debated theories late into the night. Each explanation answered certain questions while creating new contradictions. One recurring question haunted investigators more than any other. Why had no one witnessed the abduction? Queensville was not an isolated wilderness. Children played outside. Adults drove nearby roads. Residents worked in surrounding fields. For a child to disappear without reliable eyewitnesses suggested remarkable speed, extraordinary planning, or incredible luck on the part of the offender. Perhaps all three. Police appealed repeatedly for anyone who might have noticed an unfamiliar vehicle parked along rural roads. Drivers were urged to remember unusual encounters from weeks earlier. Even memories that initially seemed insignificant could become crucial. Human recollection, however, is fragile. As time passed, confidence faded. Details blurred. Honest witnesses began doubting their own observations. Meanwhile, advances occurring quietly inside forensic science had not yet reached practical application in criminal investigations. DNA profiling remained largely experimental. The revolutionary techniques that would later transform homicide investigations across the world were still years away from becoming routine police tools. Evidence preserved in Christine's case waited silently inside secure storage, carrying secrets no laboratory of the mid-1980s could fully unlock. Investigators did not know that. They believed answers had to come from people, from interviews, from confessions, from traditional detective work. As public frustration intensified, pressure on police leadership became immense. Editorials questioned whether mistakes had already been made. Citizens demanded visible progress. Politicians promised continued support while privately expecting results. Every unsuccessful month increased the possibility that investigators might focus too narrowly on individuals who appeared suspicious rather than those actually responsible. History has shown that prolonged investigations can create dangerous psychological traps. When evidence remains scarce and public pressure grows relentless, investigators naturally search for patterns. They seek consistency among fragments of information. They attempt to construct coherent narratives from incomplete facts. Sometimes those narratives prove correct. Sometimes they do not. The Christine Jessup investigation approached exactly that crossroads. Among the growing number of individuals examined by police were people whose names surfaced through proximity, acquaintance, or circumstance rather than direct evidence. Each interview added another layer to an increasingly complicated picture. Some inconsistencies appeared meaningful at first glance but weakened upon closer examination. Others seemed trivial until viewed alongside unrelated statements. Detectives believed persistence would eventually expose deception. They could not yet imagine how profoundly the investigation itself would soon reshape the lives of innocent people. Within police headquarters, confidence remained that the case was solvable. Somewhere inside thousands of interviews, hundreds of physical exhibits, and countless investigative notes lay the missing connection. Someone had made a mistake. Someone knew more than they admitted. But someone was protecting the killer, or perhaps was the killer. That conviction drove investigators forward despite exhaustion and disappointment. Outside the investigation rooms, life continued for most Canadians. Children returned to school. Families celebrated holidays. Communities slowly regained fragments of normality. But in Queensville, normal life never truly returned. Parents continued escorting children on walks that once required no supervision. Strangers attracted immediate suspicion. Every unfamiliar vehicle entering the neighborhood drew careful attention. Christine's photograph remained fixed in public memory, a permanent reminder that unimaginable violence could arrive without warning even in the safest communities. As winter surrendered to spring and another season began, detectives intensified scrutiny of individuals connected indirectly to the investigation, believing that patient, methodical pressure might eventually crack the case. None of them realized that the next major development would not bring certainty but controversy, launching one of Canada's most painful miscarriages of justice while allowing the true killer to disappear even deeper into the shadows, hidden behind a false sense of progress that would endure for years before science finally uncovered the truth no witness had ever been able to provide. As months stretched into years, the investigation entered its most dangerous stage not because detectives had stopped searching, but because the overwhelming desire to solve the murder began competing with the obligation to prove every conclusion beyond doubt. Public outrage had never disappeared. Every anniversary of Christine Jessup's death brought renewed headlines, renewed questions, and renewed criticism directed toward investigators. The murder of a 9-year-old girl had become more than an unsolved homicide. It had become a national symbol of fear. Canadians wanted justice. Christine's family wanted answers. Police wanted an arrest. Under that immense pressure, the line between suspicion and certainty became increasingly fragile. Investigators revisited every interview they had conducted since October 1984. Boxes of statements were reopened. Detectives who had spent years studying the case began noticing details that previously seemed insignificant. A forgotten conversation, an inconsistent timeline, a witness who appeared uncertain during questioning. In a complex investigation, these fragments often become the foundation of new theories. Sometimes they expose the truth. Other times, they create an illusion that appears convincing only because investigators desperately want the puzzle to fit together. Attention gradually focused on a man living within Christine's broader community. His name was Guy Paul Morin. Morin was a quiet musician with an introverted personality. He kept largely to himself, preferred solitude over social gatherings, and often appeared uncomfortable during conversations with strangers. Friends described him as shy. Neighbors considered him unusual but not dangerous. His reserved behavior, however, stood in stark contrast to public expectations of how an innocent person should react during a major police investigation. In an atmosphere already saturated with fear, being different became a liability. Police interviewed Morin. Then they interviewed him again and again. Detectives examined his daily routine, employment records, hobbies, relationships, and movements on the day Christine disappeared. They searched for inconsistencies, comparing each statement against witness recollections collected years earlier. Every discrepancy, no matter how small, attracted attention. As investigators concentrated more heavily on Morin, confirmation bias began creeping quietly into the investigation. Instead of asking who could have committed the crime, the investigation increasingly asked whether Guy Paul Morin had committed it. That subtle shift changed everything. Search warrants followed. His home was examined. Personal belongings were collected. Hair samples, fingerprints, and biological evidence were compared against material recovered during the investigation. Forensic specialists worked tirelessly, but the scientific techniques available during the late 1980s still lacked the precision that later generations would consider routine. Meanwhile, rumors spread rapidly throughout the community. People noticed police activity. Reporters followed every development. Newspapers began publishing Morin's name. Without a conviction, public opinion had already started reaching its own conclusions. For many residents, the existence of a suspect created emotional relief. The terrifying uncertainty that had gripped Ontario for years suddenly seemed closer to ending. Human psychology naturally seeks closure. Communities traumatized by violent crime often want someone to blame. Unfortunately, that desire can become dangerously powerful before evidence has fully established the truth. Morin maintained his innocence from the beginning. He denied harming Christine. He cooperated extensively with investigators. Yet every denial appeared, to some observers, as further evidence of deception. Detectives continued assembling what they believed was a compelling circumstantial case. Witness recollections evolved over time. Some remembered details differently than they had years earlier. Others became more confident, despite the natural fading of memory. Modern psychological research has repeatedly demonstrated that memory is not a perfect recording of events. It changes. It absorbs outside influences. It becomes vulnerable to suggestion, media coverage, repeated questioning, and the passage of time. In the Christine Jessup investigation, those vulnerabilities would later become painfully significant. The prosecution's theory gradually took shape. It suggested that Morin had encountered Christine on the afternoon she disappeared and was responsible for her murder. Although physical evidence remained limited, prosecutors believed the collection of circumstantial evidence, witness testimony, and forensic interpretation would convince a jury beyond reasonable doubt. The criminal justice system began moving toward trial. Across Canada, media attention intensified dramatically. Television crews gathered outside courthouses. Newspapers devoted front pages to every procedural development. Commentators debated the strength of the evidence. For Christine's grieving family, each new hearing carried hope that justice might finally arrive. For Guy Paul Morin, every hearing represented another step toward losing the life he had always known. The courtroom became the next battlefield. Prosecutors presented their case carefully, arguing that the accumulated evidence pointed clearly toward Morin. Defense lawyers challenged witness reliability. They questioned investigative methods. They attacked forensic conclusions. Experts testified. Police officers described years of investigative work. Scientific evidence was explained using the technology available at the time. Jurors listened as each side attempted to reconstruct events that had occurred years earlier. Unlike modern criminal trials benefiting from advanced DNA analysis, this case depended heavily upon interpretation. Interpretation of statements. Interpretation of timelines. Interpretation of physical evidence that often resisted definitive conclusions. Every uncertain detail became a matter of competing opinions. Outside the courtroom, public emotion reached extraordinary levels. Many Canadians believed police had finally captured Christine's killer. Others worried that too many unanswered questions remained. Editorials appeared supporting both positions. Talk radio programs debated the evidence daily. The nation watched closely. For investigators who had devoted years to the case, the trial represented validation of their work. For prosecutors, it represented an opportunity to deliver long-awaited justice. For the defense, it represented a fight against what they believed was a deeply flawed investigation. When the legal proceedings concluded, the outcome shocked many observers. The first trial did not produce the final resolution prosecutors had expected. Legal complications and appeals continued. Rather than bringing closure, the process became even more complicated. The case returned to court. Evidence was reviewed again. Arguments intensified. Years passed while legal battles continued unfolding. Eventually, Guy Paul Morin was convicted. The decision appeared to answer one of Canada's most haunting criminal mysteries. And many believed the case had finally ended. Christine's family believed justice had been achieved. Police publicly defended the investigation. A public largely accepted the verdict. But beneath that apparent certainty, uncomfortable questions refused to disappear. Some forensic findings remained disputed. Certain witness testimony remained controversial. Independent observers expressed concern about investigative procedures. Defense lawyers insisted critical mistakes had occurred. Those concerns initially attracted little public attention because the emotional desire for closure remained overwhelming. Once society believes a mystery has been solved, it becomes difficult to imagine that the solution itself might be wrong. Morin entered prison carrying the label of child murderer. His reputation collapsed. His personal life disintegrated. Friends disappeared. Employment opportunities vanished. His name became permanently associated with one of Canada's most infamous crimes. Yet he continued insisting on the same simple statement he had repeated from the beginning. He was innocent. While Morin lived behind prison walls, the real killer unknown to police, prosecutors, judges, jurors, journalists, and nearly every Canadian continued living freely. The true offender watched years pass without arrest. Every anniversary strengthened the illusion that justice had already been served. Every newspaper describing the conviction reduced the likelihood that investigators would continue searching elsewhere. The case appeared closed, officially solved, publicly celebrated. But science was quietly changing. Across laboratories around the world, forensic DNA technology evolved at astonishing speed. Methods became more accurate. Smaller biological samples became usable. Evidence once considered inconclusive suddenly contained extraordinary investigative value. Cases previously impossible to solve began yielding answers. Wrongful convictions started collapsing under the weight of objective genetic evidence. A revolution was underway. Inside secure evidence storage connected to Christine Jessup's murder investigation, carefully preserved exhibits remained untouched. Investigators in 1984 could never have imagined what future scientists would eventually discover within those microscopic traces. The evidence had been waiting patiently all along. It had never lied. It had never changed. It simply required technology advanced enough to understand what it had been silently preserving for decades. As appeals continued, independent experts began re-examining aspects of the prosecution's case using newer scientific methods. Questions multiplied. Assumptions made years earlier appeared increasingly uncertain. Confidence that once seemed unshakable slowly began cracking under the pressure of modern forensic analysis. For Guy Paul Morin, those developments represented the first faint possibility that the justice system might finally reconsider the evidence. For investigators still convinced of his guilt, they represented unwelcome complications. For Christine Jessup's family, they threatened to reopen wounds they had struggled for years to survive. No one yet understood how profound the coming revelations would become. Because the next scientific breakthrough would accomplish something almost unimaginable, it would not merely challenge the conviction, it would destroy it. And once that happened, Canada would be forced to confront a devastating possibility far more frightening than an unsolved murder. If Guy Paul Morin had never killed Christine Jessup, then the person who did had escaped justice for years while an innocent man paid the price. The foundation of the case began to crack not with a dramatic confession or the sudden appearance of a forgotten witness, but inside forensic laboratories where science had advanced far beyond anything investigators possessed in 1984. Throughout the early 1990s, DNA profiling transformed criminal investigations around the world. Cases once dependent upon eyewitness testimony, circumstantial evidence, and competing theories suddenly had access to something far more objective. Biological evidence could now speak with extraordinary precision. Tiny traces invisible to the naked eye could identify, eliminate, or expose individuals with a degree of certainty unimaginable only a few years earlier. For many investigators, DNA became the most powerful tool ever introduced into modern policing. For Guy Paul Morin, it became the only voice capable of cutting through years of accusation. His legal team had never abandoned the fight. From the beginning, they argued that the investigation had been driven by assumption rather than certainty. They questioned witness reliability. They challenged the interpretation of forensic evidence. They pointed to inconsistencies that prosecutors had minimized during trial. Most importantly, they insisted that science, not speculation, should determine whether Morin had committed one of Canada's most infamous murders. The request was simple. Test the evidence again. This time, use the newest DNA technology. The biological material preserved from Christine Jessup's murder was carefully retrieved from secure evidence storage. Forensic specialists handled every exhibit with extraordinary caution. Years had passed since the homicide. Some evidence had naturally degraded. Scientists understood they were working with fragile material collected under procedures developed long before anyone anticipated the capabilities of modern DNA analysis. The laboratory process unfolded slowly. Every sample was examined repeatedly. Strict contamination controls were followed. Independent verification became essential because the consequences would reach far beyond a single criminal case. If the results confirmed Morin's guilt, public confidence in the conviction would strengthen dramatically. If they did not, everything would change. When the DNA analysis was completed, the findings stunned everyone involved. The genetic profile recovered from critical evidence did not match Guy Paul Morin. Not partially, not ambiguously. It excluded him. The implications spread through the legal system like a shockwave. For years, prosecutors had argued that Morin was responsible. A jury had convicted him. He had served years behind bars. Now, the most reliable scientific evidence available declared that the biological material connected to the killer belonged to someone else. The justice system faced a devastating question. How had this happened? Appeals accelerated immediately. Legal arguments that had once seemed unlikely suddenly became overwhelming. The conviction could no longer withstand scientific scrutiny. In 1995, Guy Paul Morin was officially acquitted. The courtroom decision represented far more than the release of an innocent man. It was a public acknowledgement that Canada's criminal justice system had made one of its most catastrophic mistakes. Morin walked free, but freedom could not restore the years that had been taken from him. He had lost his reputation. His career had disappeared. Relationships had been destroyed. His name had become synonymous with a crime he did not commit. Even after exoneration, rebuilding a life proved almost impossible. Public suspicion does not disappear as quickly as a legal judgment. Some people accepted the DNA evidence immediately. Others struggled to believe that investigators, prosecutors, experts, and jurors could all have been so profoundly mistaken. For Christine Jessup's family, the emotional impact proved almost unbearable. The conviction they had relied upon for years suddenly vanished. The person they believed had murdered Christine was innocent. That realization reopened every wound. The nightmare they thought had ended was beginning again. Somewhere, the real killer was still alive, still unidentified, still free. Public reaction across Canada was immediate and intense. Media organizations that had once reported Morin's conviction now documented his exoneration. Editorials questioned investigative practices. Television programs examined every stage of the original case. Legal experts described the conviction as one of the country's most significant miscarriages of justice. Confidence in forensic science had increased. Confidence in investigative judgment had suffered enormous damage. The Ontario government responded by establishing a public inquiry. Its purpose extended beyond Christine Jessup's murder. Officials wanted to understand how such a profound error had occurred. The inquiry examined thousands of pages of documents. Investigators testified under oath. Forensic experts explained laboratory procedures. Police officers described decisions made during the original investigation. Defense lawyers exposed weaknesses that had remained hidden during earlier proceedings. The inquiry revealed a troubling pattern. Investigators had gradually developed tunnel vision. Rather than continuously testing every possible theory, they increasingly interpreted new information through the assumption that Morin was guilty. Evidence supporting that belief received greater attention. Evidence contradicting it often received less. This phenomenon was neither unique nor intentional. Psychologists have long recognized it as confirmation bias. Once investigators become convinced of a particular suspect's guilt, every ambiguous fact risks being interpreted in ways that reinforce that existing belief. The inquiry also highlighted problems involving forensic testimony presented during the original trial. Scientific conclusions had sometimes been expressed with greater certainty than the underlying evidence justified. Witness memories had evolved over time. Some interviews had unintentionally influenced later recollections. None of these individual problems alone explained the wrongful conviction. Together, however, they formed a chain of errors capable of producing a devastating outcome. Canada listened carefully. Police agencies across the country studied the inquiry's findings. Training procedures changed. Evidence disclosure requirements improved. Investigative standards evolved. The Morin case became mandatory study material for future detectives and prosecutors, not because of what had been solved, but because of what had gone terribly wrong. For Guy Paul Morin, official apologies eventually followed. Governments acknowledged the injustice. Financial compensation recognized the years stolen from his life. Yet no amount of money could erase prison memories. No apology could restore lost opportunities. No public statement could completely remove the suspicion attached to his name. He had entered the criminal justice system as an ordinary citizen. He emerged as one of Canada's best-known victims of wrongful conviction. Meanwhile, investigators returned to where they had been more than a decade earlier. Back to the beginning. Back to Christine Jessup. Back to a murder with no identified killer. The original evidence was reviewed again from the ground up. Every assumption required reconsideration. Every witness statement faced fresh examination. Every forensic exhibit became valuable once more. This time, however, detectives possessed a powerful advantage unavailable in 1984. DNA technology continued advancing at remarkable speed. Techniques that had once required large biological samples could now produce profiles from microscopic traces. Computer databases expanded. International cooperation improved. Cold cases once considered hopeless suddenly became solvable. Across North America, forgotten evidence stored inside police vaults began revealing identities decades after crimes occurred. Christine Jessup's case joined that growing list of unresolved investigations waiting for science to catch up with history. Years passed. Then decades. Investigators changed. Police departments reorganized. Technology evolved. Some detectives retired. Others passed away. Christine's case file remained active, preserved carefully as one generation of investigators handed responsibility to the next. Boxes containing evidence survived every administrative transition. Photographs remained protected. Laboratory reports accumulated. Each advance in forensic science prompted another review. Each review produced renewed hope. But still, no match, no arrest, no answers. The killer remained hidden. Outside police headquarters, Canada continued changing. Children born after Christine's murder became adults. Entire neighborhoods transformed. Roads expanded. Technology revolutionized everyday life. Yet one fact remained unchanged. The murder of 9-year-old Christine Jessup officially remained unsolved. The real offender had escaped detection not for months or years, but for decades. Many wondered whether the truth would ever emerge. Would the killer die without identification? Had crucial evidence deteriorated beyond recovery? Would Christine's family ever learn who had stolen her future? Investigators refused to surrender completely. The preserved biological evidence still existed. Science continued improving. Cold cases around the world were falling one after another as laboratories extracted DNA profiles from evidence once considered useless. Each breakthrough increased optimism. Somewhere inside Christine's case, detectives believed the answer still waited. Not inside memories. Not inside rumors. Not inside disputed witness testimony. Inside the evidence itself. It would take another quarter century before that silent evidence finally revealed the name investigators had been searching for since October 1984, exposing a man who had escaped suspicion for decades, and proving that while time can erase memories, transform communities, and bury investigations beneath mountains of forgotten files, it cannot erase the genetic signature left behind by a killer. For years after Guy Paul Morin's exoneration, the Christine Jessup investigation entered a strange and painful existence. Officially, the case was once again an unsolved homicide. Publicly, however, it had become something even more disturbing, a reminder that a child had been murdered, an innocent man had been imprisoned, and the real killer had disappeared without ever being questioned in court. The headlines that had once celebrated an arrest now described one of Canada's greatest miscarriages of justice. Detectives who inherited the case understood they were no longer investigating only a homicide. They were carrying the weight of decades of mistakes. Every decision would be examined through the lens of history. Every new lead had to withstand scrutiny that earlier investigators had never experienced. The evidence remained carefully preserved. Inside climate-controlled storage facilities, sealed evidence containers sat untouched for years at a time. To an ordinary observer, they appeared insignificant: small envelopes, swabs, clothing, laboratory slides, carefully labeled exhibits cataloged decades earlier. But forensic scientists viewed them differently. They represented frozen moments in time. Biological material collected in 1984 had survived countless technological revolutions. While witnesses had grown older and memories had faded, DNA remained unchanged. It waited silently, unaffected by politics, courtroom arguments, media speculation, or public opinion. The challenge was no longer preserving the evidence. The challenge was extracting more information from it than science had previously allowed. By the early 2000s, forensic DNA analysis had become dramatically more sensitive. Laboratories could develop profiles from far smaller biological samples than investigators had ever imagined possible during the original investigation. Cases across North America that had gathered dust for decades suddenly returned to life. Detectives began reopening homicide files once considered hopeless. Newspapers coined a phrase that captured the public imagination: gold cases. Families who had almost abandoned hope started receiving unexpected phone calls. Evidence once believed exhausted suddenly produced new genetic profiles. Unknown offenders entered expanding criminal DNA databases. Some killers were identified within days. Others remained frustratingly absent. Christine Jessup's murder belonged firmly within that second category. Scientists successfully preserved the offender's DNA profile, but every comparison produced the same disappointing result: a no match. The national DNA databases continued expanding year after year. Every convicted offender added another profile. Investigators repeatedly compared the unknown genetic signature from Christine's case against newly entered records. Each search carried enormous hope. If the killer had committed another qualifying offense, perhaps the answer would finally appear automatically on a computer screen. Again and again, nothing. The profile belonged to someone who either had never submitted DNA to the national database or whose DNA had never legally been collected. The investigation stalled once more. Cold case detectives refused to accept defeat. Unlike the original investigators, they possessed the benefit of hindsight. They knew where previous assumptions had failed. They understood the dangers of confirmation bias. Instead of focusing narrowly upon one suspect, they reconstructed the entire investigation from the beginning as though the previous decades had never happened. Old witness statements were digitized. Thousands of documents were scanned. Handwritten notes from retired detectives were reviewed. Evidence inventories were verified. Every interview transcript underwent fresh examination. Investigators searched not only for new suspects, but also for investigative opportunities overlooked because earlier detectives had concentrated too heavily on Guy Paul Moran. Sometimes the smallest forgotten detail proved surprisingly valuable. An overlooked address, a vehicle registration, a relationship mentioned only once, a name appearing repeatedly without attracting attention. The modern investigation became less about intuition and more about data. Technology transformed every aspect of detective work. Computer software could identify connections impossible to recognize while reading paper files. Mapping programs reconstructed historical locations. Archived telephone records, employment documents, and property information became easier to access. Digital analysis revealed patterns hidden inside thousands of pages of evidence. Despite these advantages, one critical problem remained. The DNA profile still belonged to an unknown man. No computer could identify someone who had never entered a criminal database. The investigation reached another dead end, or so it seemed. Meanwhile, a quiet revolution had begun inside forensic genealogy. Researchers studying family ancestry were encouraging millions of ordinary people to submit saliva samples for genealogical research rather than criminal investigations. Individuals wanted to discover distant relatives, learn about ethnic origins, and build family trees stretching back centuries. They mailed DNA samples to private laboratories without imagining that the same technology might someday solve murders committed decades earlier. At first, these ancestry databases existed entirely outside traditional law enforcement. Police could not simply search them as they searched criminal databases. Yet forensic scientists recognized extraordinary possibilities. Even if an offender had never submitted DNA, perhaps one of his relatives had. A distant cousin, a second cousin, a great aunt, someone genetically related enough to point investigators toward an extended family. The concept became known as investigative genetic genealogy. Initially, it sounded almost impossible. Instead of searching directly for one person's DNA, Investigators would search for relatives they had never met. Then they would construct enormous family trees. Generation by generation, marriage by marriage, birth after birth, eventually narrowing hundreds or thousands of people into a manageable list of possible suspects. The process demanded patience bordering on obsession. Professional genealogists spent months examining historical census records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, military service documents, cemetery records, newspaper archives, immigration files, and public family histories. It resembled detective work performed across generations rather than crime scenes. Early successes transformed skepticism into excitement. Several long unsolved American murders were solved using investigative genetic genealogy. Cases that had defeated police for 40 or 50 years suddenly collapsed within months. The scientific community celebrated. Law enforcement agencies paid close attention. Cold case investigators throughout North America began reconsidering evidence stored for decades. If the technique worked elsewhere, could it work here? Christine Jessup's investigation became one of many cases considered for this revolutionary approach. The biological evidence existed. The offender's DNA profile remained strong enough for comparison. What investigators lacked was a name. Genetic genealogy might finally provide one. The decision required careful legal and ethical consideration. Canada approached the emerging technology cautiously. Privacy concerns generated intense debate. Civil liberties advocates questioned how genealogy databases should be used. Investigators recognized those concerns, but also understood the extraordinary opportunity before them. Somewhere inside a family tree stretching across generations might be the identity of Christine's killer. Specialists began preparing the DNA profile for genealogical analysis. Unlike routine criminal database comparisons, this process required additional laboratory work capable of examining hundreds of thousands of genetic markers. The resulting profile would not simply identify one individual. It would reveal biological relationships extending across distant branches of families. Months of preparation followed. Scientists validated results repeatedly. Genealogists prepared for a task that could require years. Cold case detectives understood they might be witnessing the final opportunity to solve a murder committed before many current investigators had even been born. Christine's family waited once again. Decades had already passed. Birthdays came and went. Parents grew older. Relatives watched children become adults who had never known Christine personally. Time had altered almost everything, except the unanswered question: who killed Christine Jessup? Some investigators privately wondered whether the offender was still alive. Others suspected he had died years earlier without attracting police attention. Either possibility presented profound challenges. Justice delayed by decades could never fully compensate for the years already lost. Yet identifying the truth still mattered, not only for Christine, not only for her family, but for Guy Paul Morin. His exoneration had proven his innocence. It had not identified the guilty man. Until that happened, the story remained incomplete. The evidence itself appeared almost impatient. For nearly 35 years, it had quietly preserved the answer. Scientists simply lacked the tools to hear it. Now at last, those tools existed. Laboratories completed the advanced DNA work. Genealogists opened historical records. Investigators cleared office walls to make room for expanding family charts. Hundreds of names appeared, then dozens, then fewer still. Generation after generation, the invisible trail left by the killer began leading detectives toward a family they had never seriously considered during the original investigation. For the first time since Christine disappeared on that quiet October afternoon in 1984, investigators believed they were no longer chasing theories or probabilities. They were following biology itself. And biology was quietly guiding them toward a man whose name had remained buried for decades, waiting for modern science to uncover a secret that every witness, every suspect interview, every courtroom battle, and every traditional investigative technique had failed to reveal. The investigation entered a phase unlike anything Canadian detectives had attempted when Christine Jessup disappeared in 1984. This was no longer a search driven primarily by eyewitnesses, neighborhood interviews, or conventional suspect lists. Instead, it became a painstaking journey through generations of family history, where every birth certificate, marriage record, obituary, immigration document, and census page carried the potential to expose a killer who had successfully hidden for more than 3 decades. Detectives understood they were no longer asking, "Who committed this crime?" They were asking a far more complex question: who is genetically connected to the unknown man whose DNA was left behind? The answer would not appear overnight. It would require patience measured not in days or weeks, but in months of relentless analysis. The DNA profile recovered from evidence in Christine's case was converted into a format suitable for investigative genetic genealogy. Unlike traditional forensic comparisons, which simply determine whether two DNA samples match, this approach searches for shared genetic segments that indicate biological relationships. A complete stranger may share virtually no identifiable DNA. A close relative shares a great deal. Distant cousins share much less, but still enough for sophisticated software to recognize that somewhere, generations earlier, two family lines intersected. The first results were encouraging. The unknown killer's DNA did not point directly to a single person. Instead, it pointed toward several distant relatives. None of them were suspects. Most had never heard of Christine Jessup. Some lived in different provinces. Others lived outside Canada. Yet collectively, they formed the beginning of a genetic map. Professional genealogists now face the enormous challenge of transforming that map into a family tree spanning generations. Large sheets of paper covered office walls. Digital genealogy software expanded hour after hour. Names multiplied rapidly. Parents connected two children. Children grew into adults who married into other families. Entire branches spread across decades of Canadian history. Every historical record became another piece of an enormous puzzle. Investigators remained remarkably disciplined. Unlike earlier phases of the investigation, they resisted jumping to conclusions. No individual became a suspect simply because of family connections. Every possibility required independent verification. The process eliminated people methodically. Age, location, opportunity, known movements, employment, military service, health records where legally accessible, travel history. Every factor helped narrow the field. Weeks became months. The family tree continued shrinking. Hundreds of individuals became dozens. Dozens became fewer still. One branch of the genealogy repeatedly drew investigators' attention. Several descendants shared precisely the type of genetic relationship expected if one member of that extended family had left the DNA recovered from Christine's murder. Detectives quietly shifted their focus toward identifying every male within that family who had been an adult in 1984. The list remained manageable, but caution remained essential. The tragedy of Guy Paul Moran remained fresh in institutional memory. Nobody wanted another innocent person publicly suspected. This investigation would proceed silently until evidence justified every step. Historical records became increasingly important. Investigators examined where each potential candidate had lived during the early 1980s. Employment files established daily routines. Property records confirmed addresses. Vehicle registrations revealed access to transportation. Some names disappeared almost immediately because geography made involvement impossible. Others were eliminated through age. Several had died before Christine disappeared. One by one, possibilities vanished. Eventually, attention concentrated on a single individual. His name was Calvin Hoover. Unlike Guy Paul Moran, Hoover had never become the focus of public suspicion. He had never faced widespread media attention. His name had scarcely appeared in the original investigation, and to most Canadians, he was completely unknown. Detectives immediately began reconstructing every available detail of Hoover's life during 1984. Where had he lived? And where had he worked? Did his daily movements place him near Queensville? Did he possess access to a vehicle? Did he have any known connection, direct or indirect, to the area where Christine disappeared? The answers proved increasingly significant. Investigators discovered that Hoover had lived within reasonable proximity to locations central to the investigation. Nothing established guilt by itself. But unlike countless earlier theories, These facts aligned with the genetic evidence rather than contradicting it. The next challenge involved obtaining Hoover's DNA. Ordinarily, detectives might collect discarded items from a living suspect: a drinking cup, a cigarette, a tissue thrown into public trash. Modern forensic investigations frequently rely upon abandoned DNA because individuals generally have no expectation of privacy once they voluntarily discard biological material. But this case presented a major complication. Calvin Hoover had died years earlier and could not be interviewed. He could not provide a voluntary DNA sample. Investigators had to identify another lawful scientific method capable of determining whether Hoover's genetic profile matched the killer's DNA. Forensic specialists turned to surviving biological material associated with Hoover. The exact investigative methods remained carefully protected during portions of the inquiry to preserve legal integrity and investigative confidentiality. What became publicly known later was that scientists successfully obtained DNA suitable for comparison through legally authorized forensic procedures. Laboratories prepared for one of the most important comparisons in Canadian criminal history. Every safeguard was followed. Independent scientists reviewed procedures. Quality control measures exceeded ordinary standards. Nobody wanted uncertainty. The consequences would reach across 35 years. The DNA extracted from material associated with Calvin Hoover entered the laboratory. The unknown DNA recovered from Christine Jessup's murder was already waiting. Scientists began comparing genetic markers, and one after another, locus after locus. The process unfolded with clinical precision. DNA does not speculate. It does not become influenced by media coverage. It does not care about public opinion. Either two genetic profiles match, or they do not. Investigators waited. Christine's family knew nothing about the specific scientific developments unfolding behind laboratory doors. The public remained unaware. Media organizations continued treating the case as an unresolved mystery. Only a remarkably small group of detectives, forensic scientists, prosecutors, and genealogical specialists understood how close they might finally be to identifying the killer. Then the laboratory completed its work. The results were unmistakable. Calvin Hoover's DNA matched the biological evidence recovered from Christine Jessup's murder. After 35 years, the unknown genetic profile finally had a name. Silence filled the investigation team. Not celebration, not excitement. Silence. Some detectives had devoted years to the case. Others had inherited it from retired investigators. Several had studied the wrongful conviction of Guy Paul Morin throughout their careers. Now they stood at the end of a journey that had begun before many of them had entered law enforcement. The evidence pointed to a man who could no longer be prosecuted. Calvin Hoover had died in 2015. Justice, in the traditional courtroom sense, would never occur. There would be no arrest, no interrogation, no trial, no jury, no sentence. Instead, investigators focused upon one remaining responsibility: absolute certainty. Every aspect of the genealogy required independent confirmation. Every laboratory procedure underwent review. Historical records were verified again. Alternative explanations were tested and rejected. The investigation had learned painful lessons decades earlier. This time, no conclusion would be announced until every available piece of evidence supported exactly the same answer. Piece by piece, the case aligned. The genealogy fit. The historical timeline fit. The geographical information fit. Most importantly, the DNA fit. After more than 3 decades of uncertainty, Christine Jessup's murder investigation finally possessed the one thing it had always lacked: scientific certainty regarding the identity of the offender. What remained was informing Christine's family, preparing the public announcement, and explaining to an entire nation how one of Canada's most haunting cold cases had finally been solved, not through a confession, not through a forgotten eyewitness, and not through luck, but through a microscopic biological signature that had waited patiently for 35 years until science became advanced enough to reveal the truth that had been hidden in silence since the autumn afternoon when a little girl never came home. The moment investigators accepted that the DNA evidence identified Calvin Hoover as Christine Jessup's killer, the investigation shifted from searching for a suspect to proving a historical conclusion beyond every reasonable doubt. The distinction was critical. Hoover had died in 2015. There would be no interrogation, no opportunity to confront him with the evidence, and no courtroom where prosecutors could present their case before a jury. Everything investigators announced would be scrutinized by legal experts, forensic scientists, journalists, and a public that still remembered the catastrophic mistake made decades earlier. After the wrongful conviction of Guy Paul Morin, no investigator wanted Canada to experience another premature declaration. Every conclusion had to withstand the highest possible standard of scientific and investigative review. Senior detectives reopened every chapter of the original case with Calvin Hoover in mind. Not to force the evidence into a new narrative, to determine whether the existing facts naturally aligned with the man identified by DNA. This time, they deliberately avoided the investigative tunnel vision that had contributed to the earlier miscarriage of justice. Every question was asked from the beginning. Where had Hoover been living in October 1984? Did he have legitimate reasons to travel through areas connected to Christine's disappearance? What vehicles did he own or have access to? Who knew him during that period? Had anyone ever reported suspicious behavior that investigators failed to recognize decades earlier? Detectives spent months reconstructing a life that had already ended. Employment records were examined. Historical addresses were confirmed. Archived public records were reviewed. Old acquaintances were located and interviewed where possible. People who had known Hoover during the early 1980s were often surprised to receive calls from investigators so many years later. For many, memories had faded. Some remembered him only vaguely. Others recalled ordinary conversations, routine workplaces, or social encounters that had seemed completely insignificant at the time. No single witness suddenly solved the case. Instead, investigators assembled hundreds of small pieces, like individual stones forming a larger picture. Some former acquaintances described Hoover as quiet. Others remembered him as reserved. Several recalled nothing unusual whatsoever. From an investigative standpoint, that was neither surprising nor unusual. Many violent offenders live outwardly ordinary lives. They maintain employment, develop friendships, raise families, and interact with neighbors without attracting significant suspicion. Criminal investigations frequently reveal that public appearance and private actions bear little resemblance to one another. Investigators also searched for any known history of violent offenses involving Hoover. Unlike many notorious serial offenders, he had never become a nationally recognized criminal. He had not spent decades appearing on police most wanted lists. His name was absent from the public imagination surrounding Christine's murder. That absence explained why investigators in the 1980s had never concentrated heavily upon him. Without DNA, there had been little reason to do so. Modern forensic science had effectively reached backward through time and illuminated someone who had remained invisible during the original investigation. The DNA itself remained the centerpiece of the case. Independent experts reviewed laboratory procedures once again. Statistical probabilities were calculated repeatedly. Quality assurance documentation underwent extensive examination. Every stage of evidence handling from preservation in 1984 to modern laboratory analysis received meticulous scrutiny. The conclusions remained unchanged. The biological evidence recovered from Christine Jessup's murder matched Calvin Hoover. For investigators, this represented the strongest form of identification available. Unlike eyewitness testimony, DNA does not become influenced by media reports. Unlike memory, it does not fade. Unlike circumstantial evidence, it does not depend upon interpretation of behavior. It simply reflects biological fact. As detectives finalized their investigative report, another profoundly important responsibility emerged. They needed to inform Christine Jessup's family. No public announcement would occur before those closest to Christine learned the truth privately. For the family, the meeting carried unimaginable emotional complexity. 35 years had passed. Entire generations had grown older. The family had endured the murder itself, years of uncertainty, the conviction of Guy Paul Morin, his eventual exoneration, and decades of renewed uncertainty afterward. Now investigators returned carrying answers. But those answers came with painful limitations. The identified killer was already dead. No criminal trial would ever occur. No courtroom testimony. And no sentencing. No opportunity to hear the offender acknowledge responsibility. Justice, in its traditional legal form, had become impossible years earlier. What remained was truth. For many families of homicide victims, truth possesses enormous value even when prosecution can no longer occur. Knowing who committed the crime ends one form of uncertainty. It does not erase grief. It does not restore the life that was taken. But it replaces endless speculation with factual certainty. Investigators explained the DNA findings carefully. They described the genealogy process. They answered questions. They acknowledged the years of suffering caused not only by the murder, but also by the wrongful conviction that had delayed the real investigation for decades. The emotional impact proved overwhelming. Some family members expressed relief. Others experienced renewed grief. Many felt both emotions simultaneously. Across police headquarters, preparations began for one of the most significant press conferences in Canadian investigative history. Officials understood that public confidence depended upon complete transparency. Journalists would ask difficult questions. Why had Hoover not been identified earlier? Could the murder have been solved decades sooner? Would Christine's case have remained unsolved forever without genetic genealogy? And most importantly, how had investigators become so certain after making such a devastating mistake with Guy Paul Morin? Police leadership prepared detailed explanations. The announcement would emphasize evidence rather than emotion, science rather than speculation, DNA rather than assumption. A day finally arrived. Reporters filled the room. Television cameras lined the walls. Microphones covered the podium. Many journalists attending had reported on Christine Jessup's disappearance years earlier. Others had covered Morin's wrongful conviction. Some younger reporters knew the case only through archives and criminal justice textbooks. Now history was about to change once again. Investigators addressed the nation. They announced that advances in forensic DNA analysis and investigative genetic genealogy had identified Calvin Hoover as the individual whose DNA matched evidence recovered during Christine Jessup's murder investigation. They explained that Hoover had died in 2015. They acknowledged that criminal prosecution would therefore never be possible. At the same time, they publicly cleared any remaining uncertainty surrounding Guy Paul Morin. His innocence, already legally established years earlier, now stood reinforced by the identification of another man whose DNA matched the crime scene evidence. The press conference generated immediate international attention. Major newspapers across Canada published special coverage. Television broadcasts interrupted regular programming. International media organizations reported the extraordinary conclusion to one of Canada's longest-running cold cases. Experts highlighted the remarkable role of investigative genetic genealogy. Legal scholars discussed the lessons learned from the wrongful conviction. Forensic scientists celebrated another demonstration of Dana's extraordinary power. At the center of every report remained Christine Jessup, a 9-year-old girl whose murder had reshaped Canadian criminal justice. The story now carried two powerful messages. One illustrated the dangers of investigative error. The other demonstrated the extraordinary potential of modern science. Cold case detectives across North America followed the announcement closely. Many agencies immediately reviewed their own unsolved homicide files. If Christine Jessup's killer could be identified after 35 years, perhaps other forgotten investigations could finally reach similar conclusions. The ripple effects extended far beyond Canada. Police departments increasingly embraced investigative genetic genealogy. Evidence once considered exhausted suddenly acquired new importance. Families waiting decades for answers received renewed hope. One solved case inspired dozens of others. Yet despite worldwide attention, investigators never lost sight of the tragedy that had started everything. Behind every scientific breakthrough stood a child whose life ended far too soon. Behind every forensic success stood parents who had spent decades waiting. Behind every headline celebrating technological achievement remained the painful truth that justice delayed by 35 years can never truly compensate for what was lost. Christine Jessup never grew up. She never experienced adulthood. She never had the opportunity to build the future stolen from her in October 1984. The identification of Calvin Hoover answered the central mystery. It did not erase the consequences. Those consequences extended through generations, transforming investigative procedures, reshaping forensic science, changing legal standards, and reminding every detective that solving a crime requires not only determination, but humility, the willingness to follow evidence wherever it leads, even when it overturns years of deeply held assumptions and reveals that the truth had been waiting silently inside a few microscopic strands of DNA all along. Even after the announcement identifying Calvin Hoover as Christine Jessup's killer, the story refused to settle into a simple narrative of justice finally achieved. For many Canadians, the news brought relief. For others, it reopened difficult questions that had lingered beneath the surface for decades. How could a murder remain unsolved for 35 years when the evidence capable of identifying the killer had existed from the very beginning? How could one innocent man lose years of his life while the actual offender escaped scrutiny entirely? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, how many other cold cases, hidden inside evidence vaults across the country, were waiting for technology to reveal truths investigators had once been unable to see? The answers were uncomfortable. Christine Jessup's case became one of the clearest demonstrations that criminal investigations are limited by the scientific knowledge available at the time they are conducted. In 1984, detectives had preserved biological evidence with remarkable care, but DNA profiling was still in its infancy. The technology capable of identifying Calvin Hoover simply did not exist in a practical investigative form. Detectives could collect the evidence. They could protect it. They could document it meticulously. What they could not do was unlock the genetic information hidden within it. That limitation shaped every decision that followed. The tragedy, however, was not solely technological. The public inquiry into Guy Paul Moran's wrongful conviction had already revealed something far more troubling. Science had been limited. Human judgment had not been infallible. The inquiry examined thousands of pages of testimony, investigative notes, forensic reports, and courtroom records. It exposed how confirmation bias, evolving witness memories, and overconfidence in uncertain forensic conclusions had gradually steered investigators toward the wrong man. None of those mistakes had been made with malicious intent. Detectives genuinely believed they were pursuing justice. Prosecutors believed they had assembled a persuasive case. Experts testified according to the scientific understanding of their era. Yet good intentions could not prevent catastrophic consequences. The lessons reached far beyond Christine Jessup's murder. Police academies across Canada incorporated the case into detective training. Future investigators studied not only the crime itself, but also every mistake committed during the investigation. They learned that evidence contradicting a favored theory deserves the same careful attention as evidence supporting it. They learned that witness confidence does not necessarily equal witness accuracy. They learned that forensic experts must communicate scientific uncertainty honestly rather than expressing greater certainty than evidence allows. Perhaps most importantly, they learned that no investigation should become so focused on one suspect that alternative possibilities quietly disappear. Those lessons reshaped Canadian policing. New investigative guidelines emphasized objective evidence over intuition. Disclosure requirements became more rigorous. Laboratory standards evolved. Independent review processes expanded. Wrongful conviction commissions and legal scholars repeatedly referenced the Moran case when advocating reforms intended to reduce similar errors in future investigations. Christine Jessup's murder had altered the criminal justice system in ways that extended far beyond one homicide. Meanwhile, forensic science continued advancing. Investigative genetic genealogy, the technique responsible for identifying Calvin Hoover, quickly attracted international attention. Law enforcement agencies recognized that traditional DNA databases solved only part of the problem. They worked well when offenders had previously provided DNA through criminal convictions or authorized collections. But countless offenders had never entered those databases. Genealogy changed the equation. Instead of asking whether the offender's DNA existed inside a criminal database, investigators asked whether any biological relative had voluntarily participated in genealogical research. That subtle difference transformed cold case investigations. Family trees stretching across centuries suddenly became investigative tools. A third cousin living thousands of kilometers away could unknowingly provide the first clue leading detectives toward an unidentified murderer. The technique remained painstakingly slow. Professional genealogists often spent months building family histories from historical documents. Every relationship required verification. Every branch demanded careful examination. The work resembled historical research more than conventional police investigation. Yet the results proved extraordinary. Cold cases once considered impossible gradually disappeared from unsolved homicide lists. Across North America, murders committed in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s suddenly reached resolutions. Families who had waited half a lifetime finally received answers. Christine Jessup's case became one of the most prominent Canadian examples of that revolution. Legal experts also confronted important ethical questions. How should genetic genealogy balance public safety with individual privacy? Should law enforcement access genealogy databases without restrictions? What protections should exist for people who submitted DNA simply to learn about family ancestry rather than assist criminal investigations? These debates continue today. Courts, legislators, scientists, and privacy advocates recognize both the extraordinary investigative value of genetic genealogy and the importance of preserving public trust. Christine's case frequently appears within those discussions because it demonstrates both the tremendous potential and the profound responsibility accompanying such powerful technology. For Guy Paul Morin, the identification of Calvin Hoover represented another form of vindication. His innocence had already been established legally decades earlier. Now scientific investigation completed the story. The biological evidence no longer simply excluded Morin. It identified another individual entirely. History corrected itself as completely as modern forensic science allowed. Still, the years taken from Morin could never be returned. He had become a symbol of wrongful conviction not through anything he had done, but through a combination of investigative error, scientific limitation, and overwhelming public pressure. His experience continues serving as a warning throughout the legal profession. The pursuit of justice demands patience. It demands humility. Most importantly, it demands constant willingness to question conclusions whenever new evidence emerges. Christine Jessup's family carried different emotions. Knowing Calvin Hoover's identity answered the central mystery that had haunted them since October 1984. They finally knew who had murdered Christine. At the same time, they knew they would never see him answer for the crime in court. There would be no cross-examination, no verdict, no sentence, no opportunity to confront the man responsible. Justice, delayed for decades, had ultimately become justice without prosecution. Many homicide investigators understand that such outcomes remain emotionally complicated. Truth matters enormously, but truth alone cannot erase grief. Outside Canada, criminologists and forensic specialists frequently cite the Christine Jessup investigation when discussing preservation of physical evidence. The reason is remarkably simple. Everything depended upon evidence collected correctly in 1984. Had those biological samples been contaminated, discarded, or improperly stored, modern DNA technology might never have identified Calvin Hoover. The case therefore illustrates two equally important principles. Early investigators preserved the evidence exceptionally well. Later investigators interpreted other aspects of the case disastrously. Those two realities existed simultaneously. One decision ultimately solved the case. The other delayed justice for decades. Today, evidence storage rooms inside police agencies look different because of lessons learned from cases like Christine Jessup's. Biological material receives extraordinary protection. Investigators recognize that scientific techniques unavailable today may become routine 20 or 30 years from now. Every preserved sample represents a future opportunity, a future scientist, a future technology, a future answer. The murder of Christine Jessup remains one of Canada's most studied criminal investigations, not because it contains a single lesson, but because it contains many. It demonstrates the devastating consequences of wrongful conviction. It reveals the extraordinary power of DNA evidence. It highlights the dangers of investigative tunnel vision. It showcases the revolutionary impact of genetic genealogy. Above all, it reminds investigators everywhere that evidence possesses a remarkable patience. Human beings may overlook it, misunderstand it, or lack the technology to interpret it. But the truth embedded within biological material does not fade with public attention or passing decades. It simply waits sometimes for years, sometimes for generations, until someone finally asks the right scientific question and allows the evidence, rather than assumption, to tell the story that had been hidden in silence all along. 35 years after Christine Jessup vanished on a quiet autumn afternoon, the investigation had finally reached a factual conclusion, but the emotional story remained unfinished. Long after the press conferences ended and the headlines faded from the front pages, people across Canada continued asking the same haunting question. What if DNA technology had existed in 1984? It was impossible to ignore the thought. Christine's killer might have been identified within weeks. Guy Paul Morin would never have been arrested, prosecuted, or imprisoned. Christine's family might have received answers while the memories were still fresh instead of carrying uncertainty across nearly 4 decades. The entire history of one of Canada's most infamous criminal cases could have unfolded differently, but history offers no opportunity to revisit the past. It leaves only evidence, consequences, and lessons. For detectives who entered policing years after Christine's murder, the case became more than a historical investigation. It became required reading. Police academies, forensic science programs, and law schools across Canada examined every stage of the investigation in remarkable detail. New recruits studied the chronology, not because they expected to encounter another identical case, but because the principles applied to every major investigation. Protect evidence. Question assumptions. Test every theory. Remain open to alternative explanations. Allow science to challenge conclusions instead of forcing science to support them. The Christine Jessup investigation became one of the defining examples of why these principles matter. Veteran investigators often describe homicide work as a balance between urgency and patience. Urgency is necessary because evidence disappears quickly. Patience is essential because premature certainty can be devastating. The original investigation possessed enormous urgency. The community demanded immediate answers. Media attention intensified daily. Political leaders expected progress. Parents feared another child might disappear. Under those conditions, pressure naturally influenced decision-making. Modern detectives studying the case understand that recognizing pressure is itself part of professional discipline. Emotional urgency must never replace objective analysis. That lesson continues influencing investigative training throughout Canada today. Forensic science also evolved because of cases like Christine Jessup's. Laboratories strengthened quality assurance procedures. Independent review became increasingly common. Experts learned to communicate the limits of scientific conclusions more carefully in court. Modern forensic testimony routinely distinguishes between established fact, professional opinion, statistical probability, and uncertainty. Those distinctions protect both investigations and defendants. Science is most powerful when it acknowledges precisely what it can and cannot prove. The wrongful conviction of Guy Paul Morin demonstrated how damaging scientific overstatement could become. The later DNA identification of Calvin Hoover demonstrated how powerful carefully validated forensic evidence truly is. Legal scholars continue examining another important aspect of the case. Wrongful convictions do not produce only one victim. They often produce two. Guy Paul Morin lost years of his freedom despite his innocence. Christine Jessup's family lost decades that could have been spent pursuing the actual offender. Every year devoted to prosecuting the wrong person became another year during which the real killer remained unidentified. Wrongful convictions, therefore, harm both the innocent accused and the families still waiting for genuine justice. That dual tragedy remains one of the most painful legacies of the investigation. Cold case detectives understand this better than anyone. Many investigators who eventually worked on Christine's file had not even joined police services when the murder occurred. Some were children themselves in 1984. Yet they inherited the responsibility. Boxes of documents passed from one generation of detectives to another. Retiring investigators briefed younger colleagues. Institutional knowledge survived through detailed notes, archived reports, and carefully preserved evidence. The case became a relay race spanning decades. Each generation carried the investigation as far as contemporary science allowed before handing it to the next. Eventually, one generation inherited the technology capable of reaching the finish line. Investigative genetic genealogy fundamentally changed expectations surrounding cold cases. Before its development, many detectives quietly accepted that certain murders would probably never be solved. Evidence had grown old. Witnesses had died. Memories had disappeared. Without confessions or dramatic new witnesses, many investigations simply reached practical limits. Genetic genealogy challenged that assumption. Now detectives began viewing unsolved evidence differently. Instead of asking whether the case was too old, they asked whether usable DNA still existed. If it did, hope remained alive. Across Canada and the United States, police agencies began reviewing evidence storage facilities with renewed optimism. Old boxes received new labels. Archived exhibits returned to laboratories. Families received unexpected phone calls informing them that investigations abandoned decades earlier were active once again. Christine Jessup's murder became one of the landmark examples encouraging those efforts. Yet experienced investigators always offered one important reminder: DNA alone does not solve every case. It must be collected properly, preserved carefully, analyzed accurately, interpreted responsibly, supported by thorough investigation. Without those foundations, even the most advanced laboratory technology cannot produce reliable justice. The Christine Jessup investigation illustrates both sides of that reality. The biological evidence was preserved exceptionally well. The investigative interpretation surrounding it failed for many years. Only when modern science and careful investigative review worked together did the full truth finally emerge. Public reaction to the identification of Calvin Hoover reflected another remarkable shift. Unlike earlier decades, many Canadians now understood forensic science well enough to appreciate the significance of DNA evidence. Television documentaries, educational programs, and numerous solved cold cases had familiarized the public with concepts that once belonged only to scientists. People recognized that DNA represented something fundamentally different from rumor or speculation. It offered objective identification. That growing scientific literacy strengthened public confidence in the final conclusions announced by investigators. Historians of Canadian criminal justice often describe the Christine Jessup investigation as two intertwined stories. The first tells of a little girl whose life ended in heartbreaking violence. The second tells of how the justice system confronted its own mistakes while gradually learning from them. Those stories cannot be separated. Understanding one requires understanding the other. Christine's murder transformed forensic investigation. Guy Paul Morin's wrongful conviction transformed legal safeguards. Together, they reshaped Canadian criminal justice more profoundly than almost anyone could have imagined in 1984. Today, visitors passing through Queensville see an ordinary community. Roads have changed. Homes have been renovated. Children play in neighborhoods where entirely new families now live. Time has softened many visible reminders of the tragedy. Yet memory survives differently from physical landscapes. A longtime residents still remember where they were when Christine disappeared. Many recall the search parties, the newspaper headlines, the fear that settled over every family with young children, the disbelief when Guy Paul Morin was exonerated, and finally, the extraordinary announcement that DNA had solved the mystery after 35 years. Those memories have become part of the community's history, not because people wish to preserve tragedy, because they hope never to repeat the mistakes that followed it. Perhaps that is the most enduring legacy of Christine Jessup's case. The investigation ultimately proved that justice is not defined solely by identifying the guilty. It is equally defined by protecting the innocent. One without the other is incomplete. Every detective opening a new homicide file today carries that responsibility. Every forensic scientist handling biological evidence inherits those lessons. Every prosecutor presenting evidence before a jury stands upon legal standards strengthened by cases exactly like this one. Christine Jessup's voice was forever silenced in October 1984. Yet through decades of investigation, scientific discovery, legal reform, and the relentless determination of people who refused to let her case disappear into forgotten archives, Her story continues, speaking not only about loss, but about truth, accountability, and the extraordinary power of evidence to outlast time itself, waiting patiently until the day when justice finally catches up with history. For many people, the story of Christine Jessup ended the moment investigators publicly identified Calvin Hoover through DNA. Headlines declared that one of Canada's oldest and most haunting cold cases had finally been solved. Television networks summarized the breakthrough in a matter of minutes. Newspapers printed before and after timelines that stretched from 1984 to 2020 to the public. The mystery appeared complete. Yet for the detectives, forensic scientists, prosecutors, and legal scholars who had lived with the investigation for years, the final identification represented something far greater than the conclusion of a single murder case. It marked the end of one era in criminal investigation and the beginning of another, proving that evidence collected decades earlier could become more valuable with time instead of less. Inside police archives, the Christine Jessup investigation occupied thousands upon thousands of pages. Interview transcripts, search warrants, crime scene photographs, maps covered with handwritten notes, laboratory reports produced by different generations of forensic scientists, court records documenting one of Canada's most significant wrongful convictions, commission reports analyzing investigative failures. Every document reflected a different moment in the life of the case. Together, they formed a remarkable historical record not only of a homicide investigation, but of the evolution of modern criminal justice. Veteran detectives sometimes describe cold case investigations as conversations across generations. The officer who first collected evidence rarely remains active long enough to see the final result. One detective retires. Another inherits the file. Years later, someone else reviews the same documents with new technology and different experience. The investigation survives because every generation preserves its work carefully enough for the next to continue. Christine Jessup's case perfectly illustrates that principle. The officers who photographed the crime scene in 1984 could never have imagined investigative genetic genealogy. The forensic specialists who carefully preserved biological evidence had no way of knowing that future laboratories would examine DNA at resolutions impossible during their careers. Yet because they protected the evidence, future investigators possessed something infinitely valuable: opportunity. The preservation of opportunity became one of the investigation's greatest successes. Ironically, it existed alongside one of its greatest failures. The evidence itself had always pointed toward the truth. Human interpretation delayed that truth for decades. That distinction matters enormously. Science did not suddenly create new evidence in 2020. It simply became capable of understanding evidence that had existed all along. This realization reshaped thinking throughout forensic science. Evidence is no longer viewed only in terms of what current technology can reveal. It is also viewed as a resource for future scientific discovery. Police agencies across Canada strengthened long-term evidence preservation policies partly because of investigations like Christine Jessup's. Biological samples that once might have been considered exhausted are now stored with extraordinary care. Investigators recognize that tomorrow's laboratories may answer questions impossible to solve today. Legal experts often discuss another remarkable aspect of the case. The justice system corrected itself. Slowly, painfully, imperfectly. But it corrected itself. Guy Paul Morin's wrongful conviction was overturned because scientific evidence demanded it. The public inquiry openly acknowledged investigative mistakes rather than concealing them. Recommendations produced lasting reforms. Eventually, DNA identified another individual entirely. The process demonstrated that justice systems must possess not only the ability to convict, but also the courage to admit error. Without that willingness, scientific progress becomes meaningless. Christine Jessup's investigation also highlighted the extraordinary importance of independent review. Fresh investigators examined old assumptions. New forensic experts reevaluated previous conclusions. Genealogists entered a homicide investigation that traditional detectives alone could not resolve. No single discipline solved the case independently. Success emerged from collaboration. Police, scientists, genealogists, prosecutors, laboratory specialists. Each contributed expertise unavailable to others. Modern criminal investigations increasingly follow exactly that model. Complex crimes require interdisciplinary cooperation rather than isolated decision-making. The impact extended internationally. Law enforcement agencies around the world studied the Canadian experience alongside similar cold cases solved through DNA and investigative genetic genealogy. Training conferences frequently reference Christine Jessup's investigation when discussing evidence preservation, confirmation bias, and forensic innovation. University criminology courses assign the case to students examining wrongful convictions. Legal journals analyze the inquiry into Guy Paul Morin. Scientific publications discussed advances in DNA analysis demonstrated by the investigation. The story became larger than Canada. It became part of the global conversation about justice. Even today, forensic specialists continue improving the techniques that ultimately identified Calvin Hoover. DNA sequencing grows more sensitive. Computational analysis becomes faster. Genealogical databases expand. Artificial intelligence assists researchers in organizing historical records. What required months of painstaking work today may eventually require only days. Future investigators will likely solve cases once considered scientifically impossible. Christine Jessup's investigation helped demonstrate why pursuing those advancements matters. Every technological breakthrough represents another opportunity for forgotten victims. Another opportunity for innocent suspects to be cleared. Another opportunity for families waiting decades to receive long overdue answers. Yet technology alone remains insufficient. Experienced detectives consistently emphasize one fundamental truth. Evidence cannot speak if it is never collected. The careful work performed during the first hours after Christine's body was discovered remained absolutely essential. Crime scene investigators documented the location meticulously. Forensic specialists preserved biological material despite technological limitations. Evidence custodians maintained secure storage year after year. Without those early decisions, later scientific breakthroughs would have accomplished nothing. The investigation therefore reminds future detectives that even when immediate answers seem impossible, careful evidence collection may someday become the key to solving the case. Christine Jessup's family has often remained remarkably dignified throughout decades of public attention. From the initial disappearance to the heartbreaking discovery of Christine's body, through years of investigation, the conviction and later exoneration of Guy Paul Morin, and finally the DNA identification of Calvin Hoover, they endured experiences few families could imagine. Their search for truth extended across nearly 2 generations. Children became parents. Parents became grandparents. Life continued moving forward while one unanswered question remained permanently suspended in time. The final identification did not erase grief. No scientific discovery could accomplish that. But it ended uncertainty. There would never again be debates over who committed the crime. There would never again be speculation that Guy Paul Morin might somehow have escaped justice. The DNA evidence closed those chapters permanently. The truth finally possessed a name. Today, when investigators discuss Christine Jessup's murder, they often avoid describing it simply as a solved cold case. Instead, they describe it as a case that changed Canadian criminal justice. It transformed investigative training. It influenced forensic science. It strengthened legal safeguards. It demonstrated the extraordinary potential of investigative genetic genealogy. Most importantly, it reminded every future investigator that certainty should always arise from evidence rather than expectation. Perhaps that is why the case continues resonating decades after Christine disappeared. The murder itself was heartbreaking. The wrongful conviction was devastating. The scientific breakthrough was extraordinary. Together, those events created one of the most important investigative stories in Canadian history, a story proving that while time may conceal the truth beneath fading memories, changing communities, and forgotten files, it cannot erase the silent testimony carried inside a few microscopic strands of DNA, patiently preserving the identity of a killer until science, perseverance, and the relentless pursuit of justice finally uncovered what had been hidden since that quiet October afternoon in 1984, ensuring that Christine Jessup's name would forever be remembered not only as the victim of a terrible crime, but as the child whose case forever changed the way Canada investigates, questions, and ultimately understands the pursuit of justice. The conclusion of the Christine Jessup investigation did not close the conversation, it expanded it. Across Canada, police agencies, forensic laboratories, universities, and legal institutions continued studying the case, not because the identity of the killer remained uncertain, but because nearly every stage of the investigation offered a lesson capable of preventing future tragedies. Few criminal cases have influenced so many different parts of the justice system at once. It was simultaneously a child homicide investigation, a wrongful conviction, a landmark example of DNA exoneration, and one of the country's most significant demonstrations of investigative genetic genealogy. Each chapter carried consequences extending far beyond the individuals directly involved. For retired detectives who had worked the original investigation, the emotional impact remained profound. Many had entered policing with sincere determination to protect their communities. They had searched fields for Christine, interviewed frightened witnesses, knocked on hundreds of doors, worked through countless nights hoping to find the child alive. When her body was discovered, they redirected every available resource toward identifying her killer. Most genuinely believed they were moving toward justice. Learning decades later that the wrong man had been convicted forced painful reflection. Several investigators publicly acknowledged the emotional burden carried by those involved in the original case. Professional experience teaches detectives that mistakes are inevitable. What matters is whether institutions learn from them. The Christine Jessup investigation demonstrated that learning often comes at an enormous human cost. The public inquiry following Guy Paul Moran's exoneration became one of the most influential examinations of investigative practice in Canadian history. Its findings reached beyond individual decisions. They examined organizational culture, communication between police and forensic laboratories, disclosure obligations, interview techniques, evidence interpretation, expert testimony. The inquiry emphasized that miscarriages of justice rarely arise from one dramatic mistake. More often, they develop through a chain of smaller errors. Each decision appears reasonable when viewed alone. Together, however, they gradually create a false narrative capable of overwhelming objective analysis. That understanding fundamentally changed how many investigators approached major cases. Instead of asking only whether evidence supports a theory, detectives increasingly asked another question: what evidence challenges this theory? The difference appears subtle. In practice, it is enormous. Seeking contradictory evidence forces investigators to remain intellectually flexible. It protects against confirmation bias. It encourages continuous reassessment rather than premature certainty. This philosophy now appears throughout modern investigative training. Christine Jessup's case helped demonstrate why it is indispensable. Forensic laboratories also transformed. During the 1980s, DNA science remained new, limited, and unavailable in many investigations. By the early 21st century, forensic genetics had become one of the most powerful investigative tools ever developed. Laboratories expanded quality control procedures. Independent verification became routine. Scientists carefully distinguished between observed results and interpretive conclusions. Rather than presenting evidence with absolute certainty whenever possible, experts increasingly communicated statistical probabilities and methodological limitations openly. This transparency strengthened confidence rather than weakening it. Science advances most effectively when uncertainty is acknowledged honestly. The emergence of investigative genetic genealogy represented another revolution. Unlike traditional criminal databases, genealogy searches depended upon voluntary participation by ordinary citizens interested in learning about family history. Millions submitted DNA samples for personal reasons unrelated to criminal investigations. Researchers then demonstrated that distant biological relationships could identify unknown offenders through systematic genealogical reconstruction. The process required extraordinary expertise. Genealogists examined census records, immigration files, military documents, church records, birth registrations, marriage certificates, newspaper archives, cemetery information, and countless other historical sources. The work resembled solving an enormous historical puzzle spanning generations. Christine Jessup's investigation showed exactly how powerful that method could become when combined with carefully preserved forensic evidence. The case also sparked important public conversations regarding privacy. Many Canadians supported using genealogy to solve violent crimes. Others questioned how genetic information should be accessed and protected. Cortez and policymakers recognized that technological capability alone should never determine public policy. Legal safeguards remained essential. The challenge became balancing individual privacy with society's interest in solving serious crimes. Those discussions continue evolving today. Christine Jessup's case frequently serves as a reference point because it demonstrates both the extraordinary benefits and the ethical responsibilities